Hey guys, tonight we're exploring the forgotten vegetables that medieval farmers grew. A reality so oddly human and astonishingly resourceful, it'll make your modern grocery store seem almost bland by comparison. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this kind of quiet historical storytelling. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is there. It's always lovely to see who's joining in, maybe with a blanket and a late-night cup of tea. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine standing at the edge of a small medieval village, nestled in a valley of rolling green. The year is 1273. Before you, a low morning mist hugs the earth, and a thatched windmill creaks slowly in the distance, its wooden blades turning with the grace of a weary giant. This place doesn't smell like plastic wrap and freezer aisles. It smells of earth, smoke, and the tang of brassica leaves left to dry in the Sunday. And beneath that windmill, just off the footpath worn smooth by countless leather soles and bare toes, there lies a door, a heavy wooden door set into the earth like a secret. No hinge squeaks when it opens, only the hushed sigh of cool air rising to meet the morning. Welcome to the root cellar. It's dark inside, but not forbidding. The walls are lined with rough shelves made of pine, slightly warped from generations of use. Earthen crocks and woven baskets line every surface, each containing something precious: turnips dusted in soil, strings of garlic braided and yellowed, bunches of dried herbs curling like old parchment. But look closer, and you'll find the true mysteries. Here lies the skerrit, yes, skerrit. A pale, knotted root, something between a carrot and a parsnip, sweet and peppery, with a bite that warms the tongue. Once beloved in monastery gardens and known for thriving even in poor soil, it was often chopped into thick stews or roasted beside a pheasant if one was lucky enough to catch a pheasant. And beside it, bundles of good King Henry. It looks almost like spinach, but tougher, wilder. This perennial green was a peasant's perennial friend, sprouting year after year, even when famine threatened and barley harvests failed. Rich in iron, bitter to the taste, it was boiled down into porridge or fried with bits of fat. Comfort food for people who'd never heard the word comfort food. There's more. Hidden beneath a layer of damp straw, something soft and slightly fuzzy peeks through. That, dear listener, is the medlar, a fruit so strange it must be eaten rotten or, as the medievals more politely said, bletted. A medlar that's not been bletted tastes of chalk and defiance. But once it's softened in cold storage for weeks, it turns syrupy, like spiced apples and brandy left too long near the fire. Noble tables craved it in winter, when other fruits had vanished and the orchard was just bones and frost. Outside, the sun rises higher, burning the mist into memory. But down here, in this cool, dark place, the forgotten flavours of medieval life linger on. Not everything was forgotten because it tasted bad. Some vegetables vanished because they were too delicate, too unruly, or too hard to store in bulk for modern supermarkets. Take the rampion, a root known for its white, slender body and gently sweet leaves. Its tender greens were once picked by candlelight in spring and stirred into soups thick with barley and broth. But it didn't travel well. No waxed cardboard box could keep its spirit intact. So, as the centuries passed, rampion stayed behind in the root cellars, left in the songs of shepherds and in the footnotes of old herbals. You might wonder, why did they grow these strange vegetables in the first place? The answer lies in necessity. Climate was fickle, trade was risky, and the diet of most medieval villagers wasn't about flavour, it was about survival. So they grew what grew well in their soil, what the geese didn't dig up, what the frost didn't kill, what the priests didn't declare sinful, and what didn't lure in the neighbours' goats. Many medieval vegetables were chosen for their reliability, others for their ability to come back every spring, uninvited but welcome. Like a stubborn uncle with a kind heart, there was sorrel, a tangy green that added life to even the plainest gruel. There was Alexander's, an old Roman import that tasted somewhere between celery and parsley, with flowers that bees adored. And there was purslane, a weedy little plant with fleshy leaves and a surprising richness in omega-3 second, though they didn't know it by name. Outside the cellar, you can hear the soft braying of a donkey. A child's laughter floats on the breeze. Someone is calling out about the barley being ready to thresh. And you, still in the cool shadows, might begin to feel that these forgotten vegetables were never really forgotten at all, just waiting, quietly, like seeds in winter. Let's return to the village green now, where the gardens wait to be explored. The next vegetable on our journey? It grows in the cracks of stone walls and the edges of pastures, half herb, half rebellion. But we'll save that for the next part. Tonight, we're exploring a secret that once grew in every quiet nook of medieval life. Vegetables so overlooked today, they feel almost imaginary. A reality so strangely nourishing and quietly defiant. It'll change the way you see weeds, walls, and what we've lost to time. The air hums with morning warmth now. The mist that once curled around your boots has lifted, and above the village green, the sky stretches out like newly scrubbed linen. You walk past the windmill, its sails still spinning lazily, and toward the cottages' modest homes with walls of wattle and daub, patched here and there with moss and smoothed clay. On one of those walls, just above the stone base, a sprawl of green catches your eye. It's not planted, not officially, but it thrives anyway, bold and bright. This is wall rocket, sometimes called wintercress, a brassica cousin with jagged, spiky leaves and a peppery taste sharper than anything else growing in the garden. It grows wherever it pleases, along stone fences, the edges of yards, between flagstones, or from thatched roofs, where the birds dropped its seeds without a care. Wall rocket didn't need pampering. It didn't ask for permission. It just showed up. And in the hard-scrabble world of medieval farming, that made it precious. In a time when every seed had to be saved, dried, bartered, or begged for, wall rocket was a gift that required nothing in return. It came early in spring, sometimes before the last frost had passed, offering fresh green when winter's stores had dwindled to shriveled onions and sour rye bread. Peasants gathered its leaves for soups, pottages, and to chew raw when nothing else was ready. A handful could turn a bland broth into something biting and alive. And it wasn't alone. Just across the lane, tucked behind a chicken coop, grows sea beet, the grandfather of modern chard and beetroot. Its thick, dark green leaves shimmer with a waxy sheen, nearly black at the tips. And its roots, while not yet sweet like modern beets, are tough and earthy, full of life drawn from the salty, wind-swept soil near the coasts where it first took hold. Sea beet was one of the plants that walked the line between wild and cultivated. Monks in coastal monasteries tended it in long beds beside leeks and broad beans. Fishermen's wives gathered it in baskets woven with willow and carried it inland, sometimes swapping it for dried apples or soft cheese at village markets. Its taste was strong, slightly metallic. Not everyone liked it, but when the winter stretched on too long, when salt, fish and barley gruel had dulled the senses, sea beet could remind you that green things still existed. That spring would return, and it was rich in iron. Though no one knew that word yet. They knew only that it helped the weak stand straighter, the pale grow pinker, and the weary make it through another planting season. Step farther into the village, past the blacksmith's low forge and the fieldstone chapel, and you'll find the gardens, not like modern rows of neatly labelled plots. These were living puzzles, a tangle of function and chance. Cabbages, knotty and blue-green, curl tight against the wind. Leeks stand tall, their white stalks half buried, and among them, half hidden, half forgotten, is parsnip, long and pale, its leaves feathery and fragrant. But nearby, brushing against the parsnips like an old friend, is salsify, a slender root vegetable, once called vegetable oyster, for its faintly briny taste, with soft lilac flowers that opened only in the morning sun. It was a thing of quiet beauty in a world that rarely had time for beauty. Salsify was tricky to grow. Its seeds were delicate. its roots slow to form. But for those who knew its secrets, it offered something rare, a subtle flavour, something more than just sustenance, something a cook might smile at. A small triumph in a bowl of stew. The village healer, a wise woman with a basket, always slung over one shoulder, grew salsify near her hut, alongside feverfew, tansy, and the spiny green stalks of cardoon. Ah, cardoon, that towering cousin of the artichoke. Imagine a thistle turned noble broad. Silver green leaves and stalks like sculpted columns, bitter and fibrous until boiled or braised for hours in earthenware pots. Cardoon wasn't for the impatient. It demanded care, heat, and time. But when prepared well, it could be tender, earthy, and just a bit nutty. It featured not in every home, but in wealthier kitchens, or those with Roman echoes in their recipe scrolls, long lists of herbs, garlic, oil, and wine that clung to memory more than parchment. And cardoon, too, came with stories of Mediterranean roots, of soldiers who brought back seeds in their pouches, of monks who grew it beside their vineyards and paired it with hard cheese and warm bread. Here in this small village, though, it stood as a reminder. Not all medieval food was bland. Not all vegetables were humble. Some, like cardoon, salsify, wall rocket, had flair. The sun has risen high now. The bees have begun their lazy dances above the thyme. Children chase each other between rows of beans. And the village cook, apron dusted with flour and hands stained from beet greens, leans out the cottage door to call someone in for the noon meal. We'll leave the garden here, for now. But just beyond the hedgerow lies another mystery. A vegetable so ancient it was worshipped in temples, and yet so forgotten today, it barely earns a footnote. We'll visit it next. We begin today not in a village, but in memory. A memory older than this valley, older than the abbey bells, older even than the Latin prayers etched into stone above the chapel door. This memory lives in the soil itself, in the stubborn roots that refuse to die, in the seeds that sleep for centuries, waiting to be remembered. And among those roots, humblest and most ancient, is the turnip. Not the bland supermarket version, but its wild ancestor, knotted, fierce, and slightly spicy. In the early medieval world, before potatoes arrived on ships from the New World, before carrots turned orange in Dutch hands, the turnip was king. Not by beauty or delicacy, but by endurance. It grew in poor soil, laughed at cold weather, and swelled beneath snow like a secret. Walk into any field tended by a Saxon or a Frank, and you'd likely find turnips growing there, half wild, among beans and barley. In some places, they were treated with reverence, not because they were rare, but because they saved lives. In lean years, during war or drought, a few turnips could feed a family. Boiled, mashed, roasted, even dried and ground into meal. Their leaves were eaten too. Turnip tops, wilted over coals or stirred into broth, provided the only green many peasants tasted through the long grey months of winter. Children learned to harvest them by hand, feeling for that round firmness in the earth, listening to the wisdom passed down with muddy fingers. Soft turnips rot, sweet ones come late, and always picked before the frost bites twice. But the turnip was never alone in the garden. It had cousins' vegetables now lost, or nearly so, that once shared its place on medieval tables. One such cousin was raper root, or rapa, from the Latin. A vegetable once beloved by Romans, then carried across Europe like a lantern in the dark. It looked like a paler, thinner turnip, with a softer bite and tender greens. And in some places, it was considered more refined, used in sauces for roasted fowl, or chopped finely and served with vinegar in manor halls. Monks grew it beside their onions. Pilgrims found it in roadside gardens, and in northern forests, where little else thrived. It became a staple among charcoal burners and hermits who lived by mushrooms and prayer. In one village chronicle, an old story survives of a famine year when only the turnips and raper roots endured. The villagers gave thanks not with feast or wine, they had none, but by carving saints' faces into the swollen roots and placing them on the altar in candlelight. A simple offering from a people who knew that salvation, sometimes, had dirt on it. Another cousin worth remembering. Celtus, a strange, beautiful lettuce from the east, brought westward by slow trade and slower curiosity. Its stem, not its leaf, was the prize. Long, pale, green, and crisp, with a taste that lingered between celery and asparagus. In some monasteries, it was prized as a fasting food light. Clean, perfect for days of abstinence, when meat was forbidden and joy had to come from texture alone. Though rare, Celtus found a place in the gardens of those who were curious, or blessed with seeds brought by travellers. It grew best in cool climates, and in well-drained soil beneath dappled shade, and when sliced thin and fried with sage, it gave off a scent so soft and savoury that one cook wrote, "It warms the soul as broth does the bones." In another garden, not far from a lazy bend in the river, we find a peculiar cousin of the turnip cow parsnip, not to be confused with poison hemlock. This plant could grow taller than a man and had leaves broad enough to fan a sleeping monk. Its young shoots, when harvested before the flowers opened, could be peeled and eaten like asparagus. It was not glamorous, it grew where nothing else would, but for the poor and for those living on the margins, it was a gift, one that came back every spring, uninvited but necessary. The deeper truth here is this: the vegetables of medieval life were not chosen for prettiness or sweetness or market appeal. They were chosen because they stayed, because they came back when no one asked, because they asked nothing but space and a little water, because they forgave poor soil, bad weather, neglect, and even the forgetfulness of history. Now walk with me, just a little farther, past the gardens, beyond the grazing sheep and the flax fields now golden in the Sunday. There, on the edge of the forest, grows something stranger still. It's not cultivated in rows, not turned over by hoe or plough, but it grows just the same. Wild chervil, a feathery, delicate thing, with lacy leaves and a scent like parsley crossed with anise. It was once a treasured herb, but also, when left too long, a secret vegetable. In some regions, the roots were harvested like carrots, though smaller, thinner, and with a bite that lingered like black pepper. Midwives brewed it into teas. Soldiers chewed the roots for strength on the road. And once, in a village racked by plague, it was hung in garlands over every door, not because it cured anything, but because the scent was sharp enough to keep fear at bay. Today, we dismiss many of these vegetables as weeds, or forget their names altogether. But in medieval life, they were something more. Not just food, but resilience, in root form, and just beyond that stand of ash trees, where the soil turns to clay and the air cools under a canopy of leaves, another forgotten vegetable waits, one shaped like a heart, with leaves like fans and a history tied to wandering monks. But that's a journey for the next part. In the shaded quiet beyond the flax fields, where the ground sinks just enough to gather rainwater and the breeze smells faintly of peat, a shape begins to emerge from the undergrowth. Broad, pale green leaves, shaped like fans, curl upward from the earth, and nestled among them, pressed low to the soil, is the thick, ridged stem of lovage, but not the kind used only for seasoning. This variety has been left to grow wild, nearly forgotten, and in doing so, it's transformed into something more substantial. Its leaves are edible, yes, strong, spicy, almost celery-like, but its roots are what the monks once sought. Thick, white, and vaguely shaped like a tangled heart, lovage roots were prized in certain monastic kitchens and still rooms. Not for their sweetness, but for their strength. They were believed to clear the mind, warm the blood, and stir the appetite after long fasts. The monks who grew them understood the dual nature of this plant. It fed the body and the soul. They brewed it into tonics, added it to early spring stews, and chewed its stalks during vigils to stay awake. The garden where it grew was no grand cloister, but but a modest enclosure beside a marshy stream where reeds rustled, frogs chirped, and willows leaned low over the water. It was here that the monks also grew water parsnip and marshmallow, soft plants with healing reputations and quiet culinary potential. Water parsnip, despite the name, wasn't sweet, but it was nourishing. It thrived in wet ground, where few others dared. With pale stems and leaves like parsley, its roots could be boiled down into a fibrous mash, not quite a delicacy, but filling and dependable. Monks gave it to the sick, the poor, and themselves, especially when the rains came early and the grain harvest was light. Then there was marshmallow the plant, not the confection. Its roots were thick, pale, and gummy when sliced. Boiled with honey and wine, they were used as medicine for sore throats and aching bellies. But they were also food, especially in lean times when starch was scarce. Children chewed the roots raw for sweetness. Mothers added them to porridge for body. And monks, well, they kept them near always, in a small wooden shed beside the stream, where herbs hung from the beams and clay pots lined every shelf. One could find marshmallows steeped in vinegar, packed in salt, or drying slowly beside strips of fish. Not glamorous, but sustaining, and that's what so many of these vegetables were. Not luxury, not even comfort, just quiet, consistent survival. Yet, there was art in their cultivation too. Lovage, water parsnip, and marshmallow needed space, shade, and care. They grew best near one another, their roots crisscrossing beneath the soil, holding firm against flooding and frost. To grow them well required patience, a gardener's memory, a monk's discipline, and a peasant's faith that what you sowed in hardship might still feed you in spring. Further along the bank, near the base of a crumbling bridge, another plant has taken hold, Courtship. It's easy to miss slightly ragged, with grey-green leaves dusted in a natural bloom. But this vegetable too was once cherished. It's a distant cousin to spinach, and was used the same way, stewed, chopped, or tossed into broth. But unlike spinach, Courtship didn't bolt in heat. It thrived in salty soil. It could even grow along the edges of the sea, where the tide came close. In villages near the coast, it was sometimes called salt leaf. It gave poor farmers access to vital minerals, even when trade routes failed and inland goods became scarce. It kept bodies strong, and during Lent, it was one of the few green things allowed on the table light enough to be pious, but nourishing enough to sustain hard labour. But perhaps the most curious of these marsh edge plants is one you've never tasted. Sweet Sicily, delicate, feathered leaves, tiny white blossoms, and a root that smells faintly of anise when pulled from the ground. Sweet Sicily was often grown in herb gardens, but its culinary use extended far beyond spice. Its stems were cooked with sour fruits, apples, gooseberries, plums to cut their bitterness and reduce the need for precious honey or sugar. In some places, it was added to oat cakes or mead. It brought a brightness to food that had little room for joy, a sweetness that did not come easy, but came honestly. And when it bloomed, it drew bees, those tiny miracle workers, whose honey sustained monks, peasants, and lords alike. The marsh hums now. Dragonflies dart in and out of the reeds. A heron rises slowly from the shallows, trailing droplets like small pearls. The sun filters through a break in the clouds, illuminating the stream bank where all these strange, half-remembered vegetables still grow. Not in rows, not under glass, but in the spaces left behind. They were never forgotten completely, just set aside, as new crops came in: wheat bred for yield, carrots bred for colour, vegetables bred for travel and shelf life and uniformity. But beneath that, the old flavours still linger, in roots that taste of earth and pepper, in stalks that smell of celery and fennel, in leaves that carry salt and sun and the memory of monks walking barefoot between stones. And just beyond this marshy haven, on the higher ground where the wind dries the fields and the soil turns hard and lean, waits another chapter. There, nestled among flax and rye, grows a humble pod, a vegetable not grown for its flavour but for its wisdom. We'll meet it next, on the drier slope above the marsh, where the air grows crisp and the ground turns stubborn, the garden changes. No more damp-loving herbs, no broad leaves sipping shade. Here, the plants are wirier, tougher. They bend in the breeze and snap back like they've heard every storm before and made peace with it. This is where the pulses grow. Not just lentils and peas, the staples we still know, but the truly ancient kinds. The ones that helped hold medieval society together long before anyone had heard of pasta or potatoes or even yeast-risen bread. And today, the focus falls on one of the quietest heroes of them all, bitter vetch. It sounds unappealing, doesn't it? A name with more scorn than comfort. But to medieval farmers, especially those living on thin soil, high ground, or in the fringes of Europe, it was gold. Bitter vetch didn't need pampering. It grew where wheat refused, where barley struggled, and where goats still gave up. Its small pods, filled with round brown seeds, were packed with protein. When cooked well and long and spiced with garlic or leeks, it became something hearty and sustaining. A thick porridge, a simple meal. In some places, the seeds were soaked and ground into flour. In others, they were fermented and boiled down into a rough paste. Not exactly feast day fare, but perfect for long winters, lean months, and the days between holy days when fasting still required food. The name bitter wasn't entirely earned. When harvested young, the pods had a pleasant nuttiness, and even the mature seeds, when properly prepared, carried a taste closer to chestnut than poison. But there was a reason bitter vetch remained the food of the poor. It took time to prepare, often required multiple boils, and if left improperly soaked, could cause discomfort. But the farmers knew this. They learned the rhythms of the plant, the signs in the stalks, the right day to harvest, the proper amount of drying and storing, and more than that, they understood its role. Because bitter vetch, like many pulses, didn't just feed, it healed the earth. Its roots reached deep and pulled nitrogen from the air, restoring tired soil, giving future crops a better chance. In medieval crop rotation, when fields were divided and carefully rested, plants like bitter vetch were essential. They held the line. They bought time. It wasn't just a food. It was a farmer's silent ally. Next to the vetch grows another ancient companion, Lathyrus sativus, or grass pea, a beautiful plant with blue blossoms like tiny flags, fluttering proudly despite its humble place in the food chain. Grass pea was drought-tolerant, heat-tolerant, war-tolerant. It clung on when others failed, but it came with danger. Eaten in moderation, it was safe, sustaining, but too much, especially over long stretches, and it could cause paralysis. A cruel twist, given its reliability. In famine years, when grass pea was all a family had, the line between nourishment and poison grew tragically thin. Still, it was grown. Because there was no alternative. Because every plant was a gamble, and some gambles were worth the risk. Farmers balanced it with caution, rotated it with barley, stored it carefully, mixed it with rye and dried beans. They whispered prayers over the harvest. They taught their children the signs, tingling fingers, aching joints, and always the rule: never eat only one kind of seed. Among the safer, more cheerful pulses there was field pea. Familiar, round, wrinkled when dried. Easy to grow, easier to cook. It was a constant in medieval stews. A favourite in monastery kitchens, where rules about meat led to inventive use of every legume, every scrap of lentil, every sprig of thyme. In some monasteries, field peas were considered sacred, not in ritual but in practice. Because they filled the belly. Because they grew close to the abbey walls, protected from deer and thieving birds. Because they could be harvested before the rains turned the earth to mud. In noble homes, peas were dried and stored in great sacks. Not for the lords, but for the staff, the stewards, the stable boys, the laundresses, people who worked from bell to bell and needed something hot, simple, and heavy to eat. And beside the dried peas, fava beans, ancient and beloved, not the dainty ones of modern markets, but the thick, earthy kind, brown when dried, soft when boiled. Fava beans had weight. They fed armies. They carried workers through spring plantings and autumn threshings. But they weren't without mystery. In some regions, they were linked to the dead, used in rituals, left in dishes during All Saints' Day, eaten in silence, because they bloomed in grave sites, because their hollow stalks echoed the wind like whispers. Still, they were essential. They grew in cool soil, needed little attention, and stored well. And when mashed with herbs and garlic, they were even delicious. The Romans had brought them, the monks had kept them, and the peasants had embraced them. Together, these forgotten legumes formed a quiet kingdom, nutritional anchors in an uncertain world. They didn't need praise, just space to grow, sun to ripen, and time to be remembered. And when you stand in this wind-blown garden, where the stalks rattle and the pods split open with the faintest pop, you understand something profound. They grew what kept people alive, even if it meant planting a bitter seed, even if it meant praying. It wouldn't be the only thing left to eat. Beyond the slope, where the ground levels again and the trees return, another group of plants waits. This time, they're not roots, not pods. But stalks, sweet, fibrous, and sometimes fragrant. Vegetables you wouldn't expect. Some you've met in pies, others only in medicine cabinets. And they, too, once filled the hunger of a season. We'll meet them next. The garden changes again. You've passed the steep slopes and wind-hardened pods, and now the land flattens, bordered by a gentle copse of birch and ash. The light filters softly through the leaves, and the soil here is richer, dark, and loamy, holding yesterday's rain with a kind of generosity. And rising from that earth, tall, proud, and fragrant are the stalks. Some are thick and hollow, with ridges along their sides. Others are soft and crisp, bending easily beneath your hand. These are the stalk vegetables once central to the medieval diet, now largely vanished from memory. At the forefront stands Angelica. With its broad, serrated leaves and tall, hollow stalks, it looks more like a forest weed than food. But Angelica was cherished by apothecaries, by cooks, and by those who believed in the old ways. Its stalks, candied in honey or soaked in wine, were considered a delicacy. Sweet, warming, aromatic. In monasteries, they were simmered in syrups to treat colds, or infused into cordials for aching bellies. And among peasants, Angelica leaves were added to stew pots during spring. A bitter reminder that even medicinal things could fill an empty stomach. It wasn't a food of plenty. It was a food of knowledge. Harvested carefully, dried in small bundles under the eaves, and stored away for the season when the coughs began and the nights grew too long. One healer called it the herb that watches over the winter. And beside, Angelica grows a more familiar friend. Rhubarb, but not the thick, neon-pink stalks of modern desserts. This was the old-world rhubarb, grown for its sourness and strength. Its stalks were slimmer, more fibrous, and its leaves toxic, even then were carefully avoided. In medieval kitchens, rhubarb was boiled into thick sauces and paired with fatty meats, where its acidity cut through the richness. Sometimes it was sweetened with honey and spread on dark rye bread as a kind of tart preserve. Children loved it and hated it. They sucked on the raw stalks in early spring, puckering and laughing, while their mothers shouted for them not to eat too much. In noble gardens, rhubarb had its own bed, usually beside the gooseberries and red currants. In peasant fields, it sprang up wild at the edges, growing where the compost heap had spilled, or where last year's stalk had dropped its seed unnoticed. Its sourness was welcome. It sharpened the palate after winter. It reminded the body of hunger, but also of pleasure. And in a world where flavour was often sacrificed for storage, rhubarb was defiant, bright, rebellious. Next to it, hidden in the taller grasses, is a stranger still. Alexander's, a vegetable brought by the Romans, and for centuries, beloved by all who knew how to use it. Alexander's had stalks like celery, but darker green tinged with purple. Its leaves resembled parsley, and its flavour sat somewhere between the two, a little bitter, a little sweet, always complex. It was used entirely from root to seed. The leaves went into pottage. The stalks were peeled and simmered. The seeds were dried and added to cheese, or boiled in vinegar for pickling. In springtime, when food was still scarce and the new harvest hadn't come, Alexander's fed the hungry with vigour. In cities, it grew along walls and behind taverns. In monasteries, it was cultivated for both medicine and food. And in villages, it became known as black lovage, or simply the old celery. Its flavour has vanished from modern tables. Too strong, some say. Too unpredictable. But in the Middle Ages, that boldness was its virtue. If you were cold and tired, and you hadn't tasted anything green in weeks, Alexander's woke up your senses. Now walk with me past the stalks and toward the orchard wall, where nettles rise in soft defiance. Yes, nettles. Stinging, humble, but not to a medieval cook. In early spring, before most vegetables stirred, nettles unfurled their tender tips. Collected with care-gloved hands, hooked blades, they were washed, blanched, and stirred into soups. Rich in iron, packed with nutrients, they were the first greens of the year. The ones that meant you'd survived another winter. And their sting? It vanished with heat. In fact, some healers claimed it helped blood flow, eased joint pain, and strengthened the constitution. There were recipes for nettle beer, nettle porridge, nettle pudding. Even soldiers took nettle with them, dried and packed into bags, to be boiled in the field. It was, perhaps, the most misunderstood vegetable of them all. Not a weed, not a nuisance, but a gift. Uninvited, but generous. The stalks in this patch of earth don't look special. They're not colourful. Not sweet. They won't win beauty contests. But they're powerful in other ways. They arrive early. They endure wind and rain. They need little, ask for nothing, and give quietly. They were the vegetables of shepherds and brewers, monks and mothers. They lined the hearths of stone cottages and the garden beds of manor kitchens. They were not luxuries. They were lifelines. And further up the path, beyond the row of berry canes and the stone where the old cat sleeps, grows a different kind of forgotten vegetable, one that climbs, a vine with curling tendrils, edible leaves, tender tips, and for those who knew how to harvest it, just the faintest taste of summer. We'll follow it next. The garden turns upward now, past the patch of nettles and the half-shaded beds of Alexanders and rhubarb. You find yourself near a low wooden trellis, simple stakes tied with twine, bowed under the weight of greenery. It creaks gently in the breeze, the vines rustling like whispers. This is where the climbers live. In medieval gardens, vines were prized not just for space saving, but for their determination. They reached for light, twisted toward the Sunday, held fast to whatever they could find, stone walls, fence posts, willow cages growing upward even when the world pulled down. And among them, hops. Today we think of hops only as the bittering soul of beer. But in the Middle Ages, it was a vegetable, a medicine, and a quiet rebellion against forgetfulness. Before hops became standard in brewing, they were cultivated for their young shoots, tender and green, not unlike asparagus. In spring, before the cones formed, hop shoots were snapped off by hand, blanched, and served with a touch of vinegar or a poached egg if fortune allowed. Delicate, earthy, slightly bitter in the way wild greens are meant to be. A taste of the hedgerow, refined by practice. The peasants picked it near rivers. Monks grew it along their cloisters. Nobles hired gardeners to train it along pergolas and harvest the finest shoots for their kitchens. The leaves were sometimes brewed into infusions, the roots dried and powdered for use in poultices. But the shoots, those ephemeral tendrils, were the true spring treasure. And they weren't alone. Growing beside the hops, a vine with soft, heart-shaped leaves clings to a bent hazel pole. This is mallow, not the marsh mallow of damp meadows, but its climbing cousin, sometimes called common mallow or cheeseweed. Its name comes from the seed pods, which look like tiny rounds of cheese. But the real secret lies in the leaves, soft, mucilaginous, and soothing to the stomach. They were cooked into stews to stretch them further, to thicken broths, or to soothe the sick. The leaves could be eaten raw in desperation, but were best when simmered gently, stirred with leeks or onions. In times of scarcity, mallow could be harvested again and again, its mild taste turning from necessity into comfort. In monastery gardens, it grew among the feverfew and sage. In peasant fields, it thrived near compost heaps and old fence lines. One physician's manual from the 12th century lists it as good for humours out of balance and bellies too tight, suggesting a use both practical and unspoken. And like many vines, mallow spread in silence. It didn't need rows or careful tilling. It found its way to sunlight and left its gifts behind. But no medieval climbing plant held as much respect as columbine. Not a vegetable, in the strictest sense, but a plant so widely cultivated that it occasionally crossed into the kitchen. Its tender shoots were sometimes eaten early in the season, though with care and never in great quantity. Healers warned of its potency. Gardeners admired its flowers. In truth, it was more often used medicinally than as food. But still, its occasional appearance in the pot marked it as part of the edible world, a testament to how medieval folk blurred the lines between medicine, meal, and survival. And then, at the edge of the trellis, winding skyward with surprising grace, is something you may not expect. Grape hyacinth. Not a true vegetable by today's standards, and yet its small bulbs were once dug from the earth and roasted. Eaten in moderation, they provided a faint oniony flavour, slightly bitter, slightly sweet. The taste was acquired. But to the medieval palate, used to roots and porridge, it was something different, something clean. The bulbs were peeled, boiled, and occasionally added to pottages or bread dough. In times of famine, when little else remained, the presence of grape hyacinth meant that a family could stretch their stores just a little further. No feast, just one more day. In the twilight hours of spring, these vines, hops, mallow, columbine, and grape hyacinth gave more than they took. They grew vertically, using little ground. They held the memory of old ways and older recipes, and they reminded everyone who passed by that food didn't always grow in rows. Sometimes it climbed, sometimes it curled and reached, turned corners, hid among weeds, or rose from the places others overlooked. Climbing vegetables weren't just about space. They were about hope, about believing in a world that moved upward, that sought the sun, that didn't wait to be invited. And just beyond the trellis, where the garden opens again into scattered orchard and woodland path, another family of plants begins. They don't climb, they sprawl, spiky, prickly, resilient. They grew on the edges, near roads, along the backs of barns. They fed the poor, they healed the sick, they annoyed the rich, and they've been forgotten by name but not by legacy. We'll find them next. The hedgerows mark the end of the tended garden. Beyond them lies the edge of discipline, where the lines between what's planted and what's allowed blur gently under the open sky. Here, the soil is still rich, but the plants take on wilder shapes. Some sprawl across the ground like soft nets. Others rise on thick stalks armed with thorns, more guard than gift. And it's here that we find the spiny vegetables. Often dismissed as weeds today, they once played a vital role in the medieval kitchen. They grew without invitation, offered themselves freely, and asked only to be noticed. Their resilience was their beauty. The first is bladder campion. It grows low to the ground, sending out delicate shoots and pale blossoms that look like small white lanterns. But it's the young shoots, not the flowers, that fed medieval folk. In spring, when other crops had barely sprouted, bladder campion emerged like a whispered promise. The leaves were tender and mild, slightly sweet, with just a hint of the fields where they grew. Gatherers harvested them before flowering, steamed them, stirred them into potages, or wrapped them in flatbread with soft cheese and herbs. In some coastal villages, they were cooked with fish, creating a dish that married salt and green in perfect simplicity. Bladder campion grew along every field edge, every dusty cart path, and every hedgerow. It didn't need tending. It needed only to be known, and nearby, far thornier, waits a familiar figure, thistle. Specifically, the cardoon, a cultivated form of thistle with deep Mediterranean roots. Brought north by monks and traders, it found a home in the walled gardens of monasteries and the outskirts of noble estates. Cardoons were prickly. Their leaves were wide and silver green, their stalks ribbed and powerful. But hidden beneath their armoured exteriors was something miraculous, a flavour rich and earthy, somewhere between artichoke and celery. Preparing them took skill. The stalks had to be blanched, then peeled, then soaked. But the result was tender, hearty, and nourishing. Cardoons could be braised with lentils or layered into gratins. In abbey kitchens, they were often paired with herbs and cheese for feast day meals. In the wild, cardoons returned to their thistle ancestry, more spines, less yield, but even then, shepherds knew how to find the softest shoots. And if the plant flowered, the blossoms were used to curdle milk in cheese making. No part of the cardoon was wasted. Next comes chickweed, a plant so modest, so common, that most wouldn't give it a second glance. Yet in medieval fields, it was a staple green. It sprawled low, soft and pliable, its leaves shaped like hearts. It thrived in damp corners, beneath hedges, between rows of barley. Chickweed was eaten raw in warm months, or boiled down to accompany porridge and beans. Rich in nutrients, easy on the tongue, it served as a gentle counterpoint to the stronger herbs and sharper roots. Midwives sometimes recommended it to nursing mothers. Cooks added it to morning gruels, and children were sent to gather it before the sun rose too high and the leaves wilted. It was always there, quietly. Another spiny survivor deserves our attention: wild lettuce. Not the crisp, pale greens we know now, but their wild ancestor, taller, more bitter, and faintly milky when snapped. Wild lettuce wasn't often served raw. Its strength was in its depth, boiled gently and cooked down with fat and garlic. It became mellow and grounding, and when not eaten, it served other purposes. The white sap was used in small quantities to soothe aches. Old herbals called it sleepwort, believing it calmed nerves and eased troubled dreams. Whether true or not, the knowledge was passed down carefully, reverently. Near the hedgerow's far end, beneath a hawthorn bush, a final spiny green stretches toward the sun, goosefoot, a rough name for a plant that nourished so many. Goosefoot refers to a family of greens, most notably fat hen, whose leaves resemble the webbed foot of a bird. In medieval gardens, fat hen was not considered a weed. It was a mainstay. Its leaves, soft when young, were cooked like spinach. Its seeds, tiny and black, were collected and ground into flour. Even its stalks, when peeled, could be roasted beside root vegetables. One scholar monk wrote that it tames the hunger and does not complain. Fat hen grew almost anywhere. Manure heaps, ditch banks, fields left fallow. And because of this, it fed those who had no garden. It waited in the margins, asking only to be noticed. Together, these sprawling, spiny vegetables told a story of survival without control. They did not grow in rows. They were not pampered. They refused taming. But they offered abundance to those who knew their names. They fed children and monks, beggars and noble cooks alike. They held fast through drought, returned after flood, and filled the baskets of those humble enough to look low. As the sun begins to lean westward, casting long shadows across the hedgerow and the silent lane, you begin to understand something simple but profound. The The best medieval vegetables weren't always bred, bought, or bartered. Many of them simply grew, they survived, and in doing so, they helped others do the same. Beyond the hedgerow, where the land opens into orchard and hillside, lies another category of vegetables, those that lived beneath the soil, hidden from view, but rich with flavour. You've met the turnip and its cousins, but others remain. Dark roots, knobby tubers, forgotten by time, but never by taste. We'll dig them up next. The air cools as you step into the shade of an old orchard. Gnarled apple trees lean slightly, their branches heavy with early fruit. The grass beneath your boots feels soft, interrupted here and there by stones, molehills, and if you know where to look, the signs of life growing deep underground. Beneath this surface, another kind of medieval vegetable lived quiet, unseen, but no less important. Root vegetables were the pantry beneath the earth. They stored energy, thickened stews, and offered comfort when skies turned grey and the last sheaf of grain had been milled. And among them, many have been forgotten. The first is skerrit, once grown in long rows near monastery wells and manor ponds. Skerrit looks humble above ground, feathery leaves and modest white umbels. But below, it sends out clusters of slender roots, pale and sweet. Skerrit was beloved not just for its flavour, but for its reliability. In a time when sugar was rare and honey precious, skerrit offered a natural sweetness, especially when roasted or boiled in thick soups. Monks prepared it in thick broths, nobles requested it creamed with herbs, and peasants grew it in small beds, covered with straw to keep it safe from frost. Its roots grew in bunches like fingers reaching into the earth and had to be dug with care. One wrong pull, and the slender taproots would snap. But those who took the time were rewarded with something between a carrot and a parsnip, but softer, gentler, more forgiving. Close by, you find earth chestnut, also known as pignut or conopodium. A strange little plant, it doesn't announce itself. Its leaves resemble parsley, its flowers are small and white, and its true gift lies well beneath the surface. A small, nutty tuber, round and dark like a marble polished by the forest. It was often foraged rather than cultivated, especially by swineherds and children walking through woods. They used sticks or careful fingers to pry it loose. The flavour was nut-like, with a crunch that turned creamy when roasted in embers. It wasn't enough to feed a family, but in a world where hunger waited just beyond the gate, earth chestnut was a treat. A small reminder of sweetness in the wild. Next, we uncover tuberous pea, not widely grown, but found in small patches in certain gardens, especially in France and the Low Countries. The plant produced both above-ground pods and below-ground nodules, tiny, starchy tubers that could be boiled, mashed, or dried. Its flavour was mild, its yield modest, but it had one gift that farmers valued deeply. It enriched the soil. Like other legumes, it pulled nitrogen from the air and fixed it into the ground. A silent generosity, year after year, and beside it, hidden among the brambles near a dry stone wall, grows a root with an even older story. Wild carrot. Not orange, not plump, just pale, slender, and fragrant. The wild carrot ancestor of today's cultivated versions was once a staple in both food and medicine. It required long cooking, and even then remained fibrous, but its flavour was unmistakable. Sweet, herbal, and earthy. When chopped finely and stewed with onion and fat, it added depth to the blandest meal. Healers valued its seeds for their warming properties. Cooks dried its leaves to flavour meat. And the roots? They were dug in autumn and stored in cellars wrapped in straw, alongside turnips, leeks, and dried apples. Dig a little deeper, and you'll find the roots of cat's ear, a plant often mistaken for dandelion. Its taproot is long and pale, with a bitter edge that mellowed in stew. Like so many others, it was food for the poor, medicine for the sick, and a weed to those too wealthy to need it. Its leaves were gathered for greens, its flowers fed bees, and its roots, tough but nourishing, filled empty bellies on stormy nights. But not all underground gifts were soft. Some were sharp, pungent, potent, like horseradish, thick, gnarled and fiery when grated. Horseradish grew in nearly every village edge. Its root pierced through clay and stone. Once planted, it rarely left, but that was its charm. In winter, when cold spread and meals grew monotonous, a bit of horseradish grated into vinegar or mashed with soft cheese transformed food into medicine. It woke the senses. It cleared the nose. It reminded the tongue that fire still existed, even in snow. And finally, growing near a stream bank where the soil stays wet and soft, lies water celery, a plant whose stalks and roots were both edible. While its leaves added sharpness to soups, its slender roots offered crispness in spring and summer. Light, clean, refreshing. Water celery was gathered by hand, its roots rinsed in cold stream water and bundled with rushes. It was eaten by monks during fasting seasons, and by peasants on warm days when little else tempted the appetite. Each of these roots, skerrit, pignut, wild carrot, horseradish, and the rest formed the hidden network of survival. Beneath the earth, they waited, holding flavour and energy long after surface crops withered. They were secret stores, invisible until needed, and perhaps that's why they've been forgotten, because they asked so little, because they lived where we don't often look. But the medieval farmer looked. The forager noticed. The cook remembered. And so the knowledge passed not always in books, but in hands and habits. A glance at a leaf, a scent in the air, the tug of a root pulled from the frozen earth. Beyond this orchard, the land rises toward open meadow and light. Here, we'll find the seed-bearing vegetables, the ones grown not for leaves or roots, but for what they scattered. Grains and greens, pods and pulses, the kind of vegetables that left something behind. We'll visit them next. As the path rises out of the orchard's embrace, the land opens wide to sky and wind. The trees thin, the grass grows tall, and here, scattered across meadows and cottage plots, a different kind of vegetable has taken root, not for the sake of leaves or roots, but for the tiny treasures it carries in seed. These vegetables, quiet and unassuming, were the keepers of continuity. Their seeds fed not only mouths, but next seasons. They bridged the space between harvests. They carried memory. Among the first is Good King Henry, a name as strange as the plant is sturdy. Once a common feature in cottage gardens, Good King Henry looks like a weed, broad leaves, rough edges, long green seed stalks. But in truth, it was a farmer's friend. Its leaves were eaten young, steamed like spinach or tossed with butter and leeks. But its real offering came later. The seeds, tiny, dark, and full of starch. They could be harvested, dried, and ground into a rough meal mixed with oats or barley, or stirred into thick peasant porridge. The plant reseeded itself easily. It required no care. Once planted, it returned year after year, greeting the next generation with quiet abundance. For the land poor and the time-starved, Good King Henry was a gift. Not far from it grows orich, sometimes called mountain spinach. Its leaves shimmer slightly green, tinged with purple or red. They were used like any green, especially during the hungry gap between late winter and early spring. But again, it was the seeds that held special power. Orach seeds were hardy, surviving frost and drought alike. Farmers harvested them in bunches, storing them in sacks and woven baskets. A pinch of orach seed could grow enough greens for a family, with room to share. They were given as gifts to new couples, tucked into dowries, scattered by hedgerows, and watched over with care. In some villages, planting orach was a springtime ritual. Children helped scatter the seeds while elders spoke blessings. Nothing formal, nothing liturgical, just simple hopes spoken aloud. Grow strong, feed us well, come back next year. Further into the field, where the grass grows coarser, stands a more unusual candidate, salsify. Its flowers are bright and star-like, but it's not the bloom that fed medieval mouths. It's both the root and the seed. The root was long, pale, and slightly sweet, often roasted or mashed with garlic and leeks. But when left to flower, salsify produced delicate seeds on puffed heads, like dandelions, but grander. These were collected not just to replant, but to dry and press into herbal cakes. Though not common, some monasteries experimented with salsify seed flour, blending it with rye for lightness or with oil for poultices. Next comes parsley root, related to the familiar herb, but grown specifically for its thick white root and aromatic seeds. The leaves flavoured soups. The roots were eaten, roasted, or sliced into broths. But the seeds, sharp and warming, had a role beyond the table. Midwives used them in teas. Cooks crushed them into spice blends. In some abbey kitchens, parsley seed was added to fasting stews to give the illusion of richness. It wasn't a showy plant, but it lasted through harsh weather, and its seeds, tiny and wrinkled, carried a strength far greater than their size suggested. Then there is coriander, known in medieval Latin texts as cilantro, and loved for both its leaf and its seed. In noble kitchens, coriander seeds were used in sweet dishes, spiced puddings, honeyed oatcakes, and even early forms of gingerbread. But among villagers, coriander was more often added to bean stews or pickled vegetables. It preserved. It brightened. It lingered. Its seeds were saved carefully, dried on cloths or hung in paper packets. In some households, they were placed near the hearth to dry in the gentle warmth. Once dry, they were crushed, scattered, or saved for spring. Even a handful could change the flavour of a whole pot. Not far from the coriander, growing low to the earth and humming with bees, sprawls a plant with a name like a whisper: fennel. Fennel was known as a vegetable, a medicine, a symbol. Its bulb was eaten in coastal villages, its fronds added to fish and porridge. But its seeds, oh, the seeds were treasure. Sweet, aromatic, sharp around the edges, fennel seed made its way into breads, broths, and tinctures. Monks used it in liqueurs, healers gave it to mothers after birth, and labourers chewed it to stave off hunger. A pouch of fennel seed was a mark of someone prepared. In some towns, fennel was planted near the gate, not just for flavour, but for protection. Old beliefs said it kept away spirits, or mice, or fever. But even without the superstition, its seeds kept kitchens warm with taste. Lastly, edging toward the far corner of the field where the light turns golden and the air smells of straw, is nigella, sometimes called black cumin, sometimes love in a mist, a delicate flower, a potent seed. Nigella seeds were small, black, and ridged like tiny shields. Their flavour, pungent and smoky, added depth to flatbreads and cheese. In some regions, they were blended with honey and oil as a remedy for sore throats. Their blossoms looked too fine to eat, but their seeds carried a warrior's strength. In the medieval garden, seed-bearing vegetables weren't just practical, they were philosophical. They taught patience, the value of waiting, of harvesting carefully, of giving some back to the earth. They reminded the farmer that food was more than what you pulled today. It was what you planted tomorrow. And now, as the light fades and the path turns once again toward the woodland edge, a different kind of vegetable awaits. One not grown in fields, not planted in gardens, but gathered, foraged, hidden in the wild, but deeply known by those who watch the seasons. We'll follow those trails next. Beyond the meadows, where the last seeded stalks wave gently in the breeze, lies a different kind of bounty. The path narrows, threading between tall grasses and low trees, winding into the woodland's edge. Here, the air shifts, cooler. Still, the smells grow more earthy: loam, bark, crushed leaves underfoot. This is not a farmer's field, but it fed farmers nonetheless. For in medieval life, not all vegetables were planted. Some were found. Foraged vegetables, those gathered from forest, glade, and hedgerow, made up a quiet, steady part of the medieval diet. They were unpredictable, seasonal, but dependable in their own way. Passed down not in seed catalogues, but through memory, gesture, and the silent trust between mother and child walking through trees. First among these is Ramson's, also known as wild garlic. You smell it before you see it. A soft, sulphurous sharpness in the underbrush. Its broad, smooth leaves unfurl in early spring, carpeting the forest floor with green long before other crops stir. Ramsons were gathered in bunches, their leaves chopped into soups, layered into flatbreads, or eaten raw with soft cheese. In monasteries, they were pounded into pastes with oil and vinegar. Among villagers, they flavoured barley porridge and oatcakes. Their flavour was powerful, but not overwhelming like spring itself. Sudden, bold, full of promise. Next comes nettles, once again this time growing in the wild, beneath hazel trees and along stone walls. We've met them before in cottage plots, but here they thrive unclaimed. Their young leaves, picked with care, provided early greens rich in iron and strength. Nettle was more than food, it was medicine. Fibre, symbol, some used its stalks for thread. Others steeped it into tea for aching joints. Children feared its sting. Elders respected its return. Not far away, hiding beneath brambles and elder, grows wild sorrel. A tender green, shaped like a teardrop, with a lemony tang that lingers on the tongue. Sorrel added brightness to dull meals, cutting through lentils, brightening meatless stews. Its leaves were folded into pastries, minced into sauces, or simply chewed on the walk home. In lean years, it provided flavour when little else did. Its sharpness woke the tongue. Its presence meant spring had truly arrived. Further up the hill, in the dappled light beneath a rowan tree, grows wood betony, not a vegetable in the modern sense, but used as one in certain regions. Its leaves were boiled gently and added to broths. Thought to calm the spirit and strengthen the heart, wood betony walked the line between food and charm. Monks cultivated it for tea, midwives gathered it during waxing moons. In some villages, a small pot of betony soup was the first thing served to someone returning from a long illness. It wasn't common, but it was treasured. Close by, the bracken ferns rise tall, prehistoric, their fronds curled like fists. In some corners of Britain and Ireland, the young shoots, known as fiddleheads, were boiled in multiple changes of water and eaten as a spring delicacy. Their flavour was grassy, nutty, and delicate, but care was needed too much, too old, and they could do harm. It was a knowledge passed carefully, a grandmother's nod, a gatherer's instinct, and then there's Alexander's once cultivated, now wild. We met it earlier in garden beds, but here it thrives without borders, growing tall and glossy beneath the shade. Its leaves and stems were still eaten, still boiled and chopped into savoury pies, but here, in the wild, they tasted different. Stronger, more bitter, more honest. In cities, they were often ignored. But in villages where people remembered hunger, they were not forgotten. Along the forest's edge, in patches of sun and shelter, sprouts chickweed once again. It grows low and soft, always where you least expect it. Its mild flavour made it a favourite addition to raw salads and simple stews. But wild chickweed was also pressed into wounds, steeped into teas, or tucked beneath bread dough to lend strength. For some, it was just a weed. For others, it was a blessing. And finally, by the water's edge, nestled between reeds and willow roots, you find watercress. Its leaves float on the surface like small green lily pads, trailing fine stems below. Peppery, crisp and cleansing, watercress was prized for both flavour and nutrition. Gathered from streams and ponds, it was washed carefully, then eaten raw or tossed into hot broth at the last moment. In noble feasts, it graced dishes of trout and eel. In peasant meals, it lifted a bowl of boiled grain into something almost elegant. Watercress wasn't planted. It was remembered. And that was true for all these wild vegetables. They weren't managed or labelled. They didn't come with neat instructions or measured rows. They lived outside walls, beyond fences. And yet, they found their way onto tables, into pottage. Across mouths, young and old, the medieval peasant knew their timing. The monk knew their humours. The child knew which path to take to find them first. They taught observation, patience, gratitude, and perhaps that's their deepest lesson. That food isn't always what we make, it's also what we notice, what we honour, what we quietly welcome back. Beyond this forest, the land softens once more, and there, growing in low mounds or rising in stiff stalks, are the vegetables used not for food alone, but for healing. The ones you'd find drying in bundles above the hearth, hung in abbey halls, ground in mortars, vegetables that blurred the line between hunger and hurt. We'll meet them next. There's a hush in this part of the walk, past the edge of the forest and the echo of wild watercress. The land dips into a small clearing. The grass is short here, trodden often but gently. Ahead stands a low stone wall, half crumbled, embracing a patch of earth once tended with care. The air smells faintly of chamomile, and something peppery, green and slightly bitter. This was not a kitchen garden, though it fed many. It was a physic garden, the medieval bridge between food and medicine. Monasteries, manors, and even peasant cottages often kept such plots. Not large, not loud, but deeply necessary. Because in an age when doctors were few and coin was precious, healing came from leaves, roots, and quiet knowing. Some vegetables here were grown to eat, others to soothe. But most walked in both worlds. First among them is lovage, tall, glossy, and proud. It resembles celery at first glance. Its leaves are rich, deeply scented, with a sharp edge of pepper and parsley. In cooking, lovage added flavour to broth and pottage. Its stems were candied or chopped. Its roots roasted, but its true gift lay in the belly. Lovage was a digestive used to settle full stomachs after feast days or heavy grain. Monks prescribed it in tonics. Mothers brewed it in teas. Some villagers even pressed it into poultices for aching joints, wrapped in linen, warmed by fire. It was a noble herb for humble problems. Beside it grows borage, with its soft fuzzy leaves and star-shaped blue flowers. Borage leaves were sometimes added to wine, said to give courage. Its flowers, edible and mild, were tossed into salads or steeped into calming teas. But its stems, often overlooked, were the vegetable part. Blanched to remove their prickles, borage stems were cooked like chard, then served with vinegar or oil. In some towns, they were layered with cheese and eggs during Lenten meals, when meat was forbidden but spirits still craved richness. Borage was thought to cheer the heart, and whether by taste or tradition, it often did. Nearby, shorter but no less valuable, is horehound. Its crinkled leaves are dusty green, its scent somewhere between mint and medicine. Horehound was rarely eaten as food, but its role in healing was unquestioned. Boiled in honey and strained into syrup, it soothed coughs. Mixed with wine, it eased sore throats. Yet in times of want, the young leaves were chopped and added sparingly to soup. Bitter, yes, but strengthening, a food of last resort, but also of wisdom. And across the way, almost hiding in shadow, is customary, also called Bible leaf, named for its role as a page marker in church books. Customary had soft, leathery leaves with a scent of mint and balsam. It flavoured ale, seasoned beans, and was chewed during sermons to ease boredom or perhaps hunger. Its leaves were brewed into tea for headaches, steeped in oil for wounds. But when young, they were edible, mildly bitter, slightly minty, like a green that remembered how to heal. The monks wrote little poems about cosmary. The villagers did not, but they knew it, grew it, trusted it. Close by grows feverfew, with its daisy-like flowers and sharp aroma. It was not a vegetable, not truly, but it grew beside the carrots and leeks in more gardens than not. Feverfew leaves were boiled down and eaten to reduce fever. Mixed with vinegar and wrapped in cloth, they were applied to throbbing temples. Sometimes The young shoots were added to green sauce, a tangy herb blend served with meat or fish to lift the spirit and cut through heaviness. Its bitterness was its strength, and so it stayed, planted each spring beside the onions, where it could be easily reached when illness came. Beneath a cluster of stones, small and unassuming, is elecampane. Its tall yellow flowers catch the eye, but it's the root that matters, a thick, knotted mass with a camphor scent. It was sliced thin, candied, or dried and powdered. Some stewed it with apples, others added it to strong beer. Elecampane aided the lungs, cleared the chest, and when nothing else worked, comforted the weary. Its flavour was strange, but its effect? Gentle. Sure, near the path, just catching the light, grows wild mustard, a bridge between food and remedy. Its leaves were eaten in spring, its seeds ground into spice, and its flowers brightened even the plainest plate. But when aches took hold, mustard seed was mixed into pastes and spread on cloths, laid over sore backs or weary shoulders. In the cold months, mustard warmed more than the tongue. And finally, growing between stones, where the garden meets the wild, is plantain. Not the tropical kind. The low, oval-leafed plant with ribs like threads and a soul like a soldier. Its leaves were eaten when young, bitter but nutritious. Its seeds, tiny and mucilaginous, were steeped into gruel for the ill, and its broad leaves, crushed and applied fresh, drew poison from bites and splinters alike. It was a vegetable in the oldest sense, not fancy, not bred, just used. Together, these healing vegetables formed a quiet wall between life and death. They weren't magic, but they were memory, kept alive through use, passed down through habit. In kitchens, they flavoured broth. In sick rooms, they were crushed and steeped. In gardens, they grew side by side, with onions and cabbages not set apart, but part of the whole. To eat was to live, to heal was to continue living, and in the medieval mind, food and medicine were never far apart. Beyond the physic garden, the land levels once more, and the road forks. One path leads toward pasture, one toward the village square. But first, we'll follow the path that circles back toward the barn, where the tools are kept and the animals fed. There, growing where the compost meets the stable wall, lies another class of forgotten vegetables, those that served not just humans, but beasts. The vegetables of fodder, fermentation, and forgotten strength. We'll explore them next. The path crunches underfoot, now hard-packed earth, with bits of straw, hoof prints, and the musky trace of hay. A low barn crouches at the far end of the slope, its beams weathered silver with time. You hear the soft clink of a yoke against stone, the lazy shuffle of hooves in the yard, and somewhere behind, a rustle in the feed bins. This is the heart of the farm, not for show, but for function. And here too, vegetables once played a role, but not always for people. Some vegetables in the medieval world were grown not to grace tables, but to feed the animals, to enrich compost, to balance diets of hay and straw. These were the silent supporters, the vegetables of fodder, fermentation, and resilience. And they were often forgotten, though never unimportant. The first is field bean, not the tender garden sort, but its heartier cousin, also known as broad bean or horse bean. Field beans were grown widely, valued for their hardiness and high protein. They fed not only people mashed into thick purees or cooked with herbs, but animals as well. Dried and stored, they were added to feed for oxen, pigs, and even chickens. They grew well in poor soils, fixed nitrogen, and returned strength to the ground. After harvest, the dried stalks were burned or added to the muck heap, their ashes enriching the beds for next year's crop. Field beans blurred the line between food and feed. A peasant might eat them in lean months and feed them to his animals in flush ones. They were humble, yes, but foundational. Next comes fodder beet, an ancestor of modern sugar beet and mangold wurzel. Its root was massive, gnarled, knobby, and dense. Too coarse for human plates, but perfect for livestock. Grown in rows near the stables, fodder beet was harvested in autumn and chopped into chunks to feed pigs and cows through the cold months. Its leaves, though tough, were steamed and mixed with bran for goats and sheep, and sometimes, if a bit was tender enough, it would end up in the pot for humans, too grated finely, boiled, and heavily seasoned. Even when it wasn't eaten, its presence mattered. Fodder beet stored well, in rich soil, and kept animals plump, and a plump animal meant milk, leather, meat, trade. Then there is white turnip, not the delicate baby turnips served to nobles, but the large coarse kind grown in bulk. Turnips grew quickly, could be sown late in the season, and provided emergency fodder. When hay ran short, farmers stored them in root cellars, layered in straw or brine. Some were sliced thin and mixed into pig mash. Others were boiled for cows to increase milk yield. Turnip tops the greens were fed to geese and used to mulch fields. They were also turned under as green manure, breaking up the soil and keeping it fertile. If a crop of turnips failed, animals suffered. If it thrived, a family might last the winter. Along the fence line, you'll find cow cabbage, a rough, leafy brassica grown mostly for bulk. Its leaves were too fibrous for regular cooking. But when chopped fine or boiled long, they added mass to animal feed. In the poorest homes, cow cabbage was shared half to the cow, half to the pot, softened with lard and flavoured with onion or garlic if luck allowed. In some regions, its stalks were chopped and fermented in earthen crocks, creating a rough kind of silage that kept beasts fed during icy weeks when pasture failed. Then there's kale, yes, that kale, but not the kale of smoothies and cafes. This was hungry gap kale, a bitter, broad-leaved variety that withstood frost and wind, grown to fill the long pause between late winter and early spring. It was eaten by all man and beast alike. Cows grazed on it in cold months, pigs rooted for its stalks, and when green was scarce, it fed entire families, shredded into pottage, stewed with barley, or layered into oatcakes. The best patches were protected by wattle fencing. Children were sent to guard them from deer and goats, not because kale was delicate, but because it was vital. And growing low in the shadow of the barn, you'll find vetch, a legume with curling tendrils and purple blossoms. Vetch was not a culinary delicacy, but its value was deep. Planted between grain crops, vetch added nitrogen to the soil and shaded out weeds. Its leaves were cut for green feed. Its seeds, though somewhat bitter, were ground into mash for pigs. In desperate years, even humans ate it, though rarely with joy. Vetch made the land better. It filled the gaps. It held things together. Even weeds had their place in the fodder garden. Dock, mallow, and groundsel chopped and added to feed bins, turned into compost, or dried for winter bedding. The line between weed and vegetable wasn't drawn in stone, it was drawn in use. The waste from these crops was never wasted. Leaves went to compost, roots fed chickens. Tough stalks were soaked and softened, used as mulch, or bundled as insulation for root cellars. The medieval farm was a circle, nothing left unused. And as you lean against the barn wall, watching the last rays of sun catch on the wooden pitchfork and the slow sway of the hayloft door, you begin to understand that vegetables were not just food, they were systems. They fed people, yes, but also animals, soil, trade, memory. The next chapter in our journey leads toward the market road where vegetables were not just grown and used, but sold, bartered, measured, and judged. We'll explore that next. The sun hangs low over the village roofs as you follow the rutted lane eastward. The barn and pastures now behind you. In the distance, the faint jingle of a harness bell mixes with the creak of a cartwheel, and the scent of trampled herbs mingles with wood smoke and the yeasty breath of bread cooling on windowsills. It's market day, a ritual older than coin, a performance played in cabbage leaves and cress, bartered with eggs and riddles, measured in handfuls and haggles. Medieval markets were not places of luxury but of necessity, cleverness, and quiet pride. And vegetables, those most modest of commodities, held their own kind of currency. Here among the stalls, you'll find familiar names but in unfamiliar forms. The first is leek, Tall, proud, and fragrant, the leek was a badge of culinary honor. Grown by peasants and nobles alike, it was hardy and versatile, surviving frost and offering flavor when onions had long since rotted in storage. But the leeks brought to market weren't always fresh. Some were bundled and cured, laid in ash or sand to keep them through winter. Others were roasted and preserved in fat or pickled in vinegar with spices. Vendors stacked them like kindling. Housewives tested their firmness, their scent, their strength. A good leek meant a good broth. Beside the leeks, a woman fans away flies from her cart of parsnips, white, crooked, and sugar-sweet from recent frost. These parsnips are not delicate. They're rough-skinned, dirt-caked, and massive. And that's what makes them valuable. Parsnips sweeten as they winter. Their starch turns to sugar, and their meat grows soft. They were sold as treats for children, mashed into spiced cakes, or sliced into thick peasant puddings with eggs and rye flour. In towns where honey was dear, parsnip mash filled its place. Not far off, a boy sets down a basket of onion sets, not full onions, but the small bulbs meant for planting. They're sold as hope, as next season's soup. Some families bought only one or two, enough to start a line of onions in a sun-warmed bed beside the cottage door. Beside the cloth merchants, a monk from a nearby priory offers small bundles of herbs and healing greens. Not rich man's fare, but essential all the same. Here's wormwood, tied with twine and hung upside down for tea. There's cress, fresh from monastery beds. A small clay jar of dried burnet, a sharp-tasting leaf used in salads, and as a cooling draught for fevers. And stacked near the cartwheel, mustard greens, bunched with roots still attached, their flavour sharp, their leaves dappled from dew. In wealthier stalls, artichoke thistles are displayed carefully trimmed, soaked in vinegar to stay fresh. Expensive, rare, and almost theatrical. A vegetable with drama, but the real trade happens down the muddy row, where the common baskets sit. There, you find turnip greens, wild beet leaves, and wilted but potent bunches of ground elder. No coins needed, just to trade. Perhaps 3 eggs, or a skein of wool, or a loaf of yesterday's rye. Some vendors sell mixtures, pottage bundles tied with string. A leek, a parsnip, a handful of greens, a sprig of thyme. Enough for one pot, a day's meal. Others specialise. One old man sells nothing but scorsonera, long black roots scraped clean and cut in halves. He says they'll make you strong, but doesn't say how. He wraps each in straw and places it carefully in his buyer's bag. A girl no older than 10 sells radish pods, the young green seed pods of late radishes, pickled in brine and sold in tiny jars. A sharp crunch. A spring reminder in autumn. Market was a place of survival but also of social pride. Bringing vegetables to market meant more than nourishment. It meant you had something extra, something to share, something to show. Men boasted of their longest carrot, displayed like prize trout. Women traded stories of onions that overwintered 3 seasons. Children sold wild herbs picked at dawn, their fingers still green. Market vegetables told stories of drought and rain, of good soil and stubborn plots, of old seeds saved in linen and new cuttings begged from a neighbour. And behind every vegetable lay something deeper. Trust. You trusted that the beet you bought was young, that the cabbage wasn't hollow, that the cress hadn't been gathered from the ditch. Reputation mattered, and so did presentation. Some vegetables were bundled in fresh leaves, others wrapped in cheesecloth. A few were even scorched at the stem end, to keep them from wilting, an old trick passed from grandmother to granddaughter. Even those who didn't grow came to market to remember. They'd smell the celeriac and recall a feast from childhood. See the spinach and think of fasting days and buttered bread. Hold a bunch of mallow and feel a long-gone fever ease. In the market, forgotten vegetables were remembered again, and though many of them vanished in centuries to come, replaced by cabbages bred for weight, carrots for colour, beets for storage on this muddy lane, they were valued, not for shelf life, but for flavour, story, strength, As the sun dips low and sellers begin packing their wares, tying up carts and sweeping mud from planks, you feel the market's quiet ending. Not abrupt, just finished, like a pot emptied to its last bite. From here, the road leads not back to the farm, but toward the places where vegetables changed history. Feast halls, abbey kitchens, royal banquets, and the quiet hearths of those who had more hunger than food. Because vegetables were never just sustenance. They were power. They were peace. They were politics on a plate. We'll follow that trail next. The road curves gently towards stone and shadow toward a manor, a monastery, perhaps even a castle, depending on the region and year. The hum of market chatter fades behind, replaced by the steady crunch of gravel and the flick of a horse's tail in the distance. Here, where walls are high and kitchens cavernous, vegetables held a different role. They weren't just nourishment. They were prestige. In medieval society, vegetables carried subtle messages. To grow a rare herb was to show refinement. To serve an unfamiliar green-proved connection. To plate something strange and flavorful, that was the whisper of influence. And so, the powerful cultivated not just food, but botanical identity. The first to greet you in the noble kitchen gardens is charred bright, leafy, its stalks striped pink, white, or gold, depending on soil and seed. Chard was favoured among the wealthier households for its yield and colour, its tender leaves cooked down like spinach, while the stalks, braised in rich broth or vinegar, added texture to even the simplest dishes. Sometimes it was stuffed with spiced lentils, or layered into pies with cheese and egg. It symbolised care, wealth, the ability to spare the land for beauty and yield both. Next grows celeriac, known then as turnip-rooted celery, knobby, gnarled, a root that needed patience and a sharp blade. But when peeled and boiled or grated raw with vinegar and herbs, it brought a gentle sharpness that reminded some of parsley, others of artichoke. Celeriac wasn't grown by accident. It demanded attention. Fertile soil, thinning, weeding. Its presence on a table spoke of a cook who knew her trade, a lord who hired well, a garden that served more than just the stomach. Nearby, a row of salsify and scorzonera grows in dark, loosened soil. Long, black roots. Earthy, sweet, subtly oyster-like in flavour. They were peeled and stewed in cream, sometimes sliced and fried for feasts. Monks prized them during fasts, especially with vinegar and chopped herbs. They were less about sustenance, more about signal. To serve salsify was to show you knew what was rare, that your table had reach. A cluster of tall plants near the wall reveals lovage. Again here, not for health, but for luxury. The leaves were stewed with eel, the seeds crushed into sauces for duck or spiced wine. Its flavour walked a line between celery and resin, adding a touch of wildness to noble food. Even in abbey kitchens, lovage was used sparingly, carefully. It was strong, and strength was not to be squandered. In the shade of the garden's north wall grows a more unexpected guest. Chervil, soft, fern-like, and delicate in flavour, a blend of anise and parsley. It was used fresh, always fresh, often added at the end of cooking to preserve its lightness. Chervil was a sign of sophistication. It didn't travel well. It didn't keep. It had to be grown nearby, gathered within hours of use. To taste it was to taste a garden known intimately. Not far off, behind a wooden trellis, grow small climbing vines of garden peas. Not the dry field peas of the common table, but the sweet green pods of spring. In wealthy homes, they were picked early, shelled, and simmered with mint or butter. They signalled access to labour, someone to pick, someone to pod, someone to serve them before they spoiled. Peas weren't exotic, but fresh peas? In season? That was luxury. Inside the manor kitchens, a great hearth burns low, and the scent of leeks and vinegar mingles with wood smoke. A pot bubbles, perhaps a pottage for the household. thick with root vegetables, herbs, barley. Even here, the noble house ate much the same base fare as the peasant, just with additions. A sprinkling of caraway, traded from abroad, a dollop of almond milk, a garnish of samphire that's sea vegetable, pickled and brought inland to taste of salt and distance. Vegetables gave even the plainest meatless dish status when prepared well. In the halls, vegetables were often presented not just as food but as spectacle. A sugar-coated parsnip, carved and glazed, a cabbage pie shaped like a swan, a stew of green herbs moulded into the likeness of a castle garden, complete with edible towers of leek stalks. The medieval imagination never wasted a chance to impress. At banquets, vegetables might be sculpted, pickled, sweetened, even dyed. Red cabbage boiled with wine to deepen its hue, beetroot mashed with rosewater, spinach pureed and used to colour dough. Each touch said something of the cook's skill, of the host's wealth, of the garden's bounty. Even the absence of certain vegetables spoke volumes. Garlic, for instance, was sometimes avoided in noble courts, not because it wasn't loved, but because its scent clung. It was food for shepherds, labourers, pilgrims, not for delicate conversation in candlelit halls, but in private. It found its way into sauces, meats, and breads, always carefully balanced, always washed down with wine. Outside the kitchens, in the cloistered gardens of monasteries, vegetables took on another power symbolism. The onion, with its layers, represented the soul's progress. Parsley for cleansing, fennel for clarity, lettuce for restraint. But symbolism never prevented use. A plant that grew was a plant that served. And even the most ascetic monk relished a well-roasted beet. In the quiet hours after feast or service, the kitchens grew still. Leftover greens were wrapped and saved. Wilted stalks chopped for tomorrow's broth. Peels fed to chickens. Roots stored in cellars deep and cool. Waste was a stranger, even among the powerful. As you step back from the tiled floor and warm hearth, the door to the garden swings slightly in the wind. Beyond it lies the greater truth, that vegetables did not only live in soil, they lived in identity, in gesture, in language, in politics. The vegetable you served and how you served it told 1,000 things. And in the shadows of this understanding, another garden waits. Not of food, but of memory, of names nearly lost, of vegetables whose seeds never made it past a generation or two. We'll walk through those ghosts next. Even the most vibrant garden eventually fades. Stalks wither, leaves curl, seeds are scattered, sometimes caught by the wind, sometimes forgotten in a fold of linen that's never found again. In this chapter of our walk, we step into a garden not marked on any map, a garden of ghosts. Vegetables that once grew tall and purposeful in medieval fields, now nearly vanished from living memory. Lost not to disaster, but to time, preference, and the quiet violence of change. These are the crops whose names linger in crumbling manuscripts, in a line of herbal poetry, in the vague memory of a seed that no longer sprouts. The first is herb patience, also called monk's rhubarb. This plant had broad, glossy leaves and a thick, slightly sour stalk. Its root was prized medicinally, but its leaves were eaten like spinach boiled once, then again to tame their bitterness. It grew in monastery gardens, near wells or walls. Its flavour was strong but cleansing. In lean times, it filled the pot with substance. In richer seasons, it was used in pies with dried fruit and honey. But over time, its cousins true rhubarb and French sorrel outshone it. More fashionable, and so herb patience slipped away. Next comes Alexander's, once cultivated widely, now almost wild again. Its glossy green stems, tasting somewhere between celery and pepper, were once found in every cloister and courtyard. Boiled with vinegar, sautéed with leeks, or steeped in broth, Alexanders were the go-to green before the rise of modern celery. But as trade brought more delicate, consistent vegetables, the rugged Alexanders fell from favour. Its bold taste was deemed old-fashioned. Its vigour, once praised, became inconvenience. Slowly, it was edged out of gardens, relegated to ditches and forgotten coastal patches. And yet, it still grows. You might pass it on a walk and never know its name. Another whisper from the past is Skerrit already touched upon. Its white, finger-like roots were once sweet and beloved, but Skerrit demanded patience. It tangled. It snapped when pulled. It needed weeding and moist soil. When potatoes arrived from the New World, yielding more food with less fuss, Skerrit was quietly put aside. A few kitchen gardens held on. A few friars preserved its seeds. But for most, it vanished. Its sweetness remains in records, its seeds in dusty drawers. And then there's tansy, not just a herb, but a green once cooked in puddings and egg dishes. Its leaves were finely chopped, soaked in cream, and baked into sweet savoury cakes during Eastertide. Tansy had a strong, bitter flavour intended to purify the blood after Lent's abstinence. It was celebratory, ceremonial, but bitterness fell out of favour. Sugar became cheaper, palates shifted, and Tansy's place on the table faded. Its leaves still grow in the wild, but few recognise them. Fewer still taste them. There was also sea beet, ancestor of our modern beetroot and chard. It grew near coasts, its thick green leaves cooked like spinach. In early medieval England and along the North Sea, it was foraged and occasionally cultivated inland. But as seed selection improved and newer varieties were bred for size and sweetness, sea beet retreated back to the brine. It survives, but untamed, overlooked by those who do not know it was once loved. Another is galingale, or sweet sedge, its roots aromatic, its flavour warming. Galingale was used in sauces and potages, especially in regions where ginger and pepper were rare or too expensive. Its use was more common in the early Middle Ages, before trade routes made Eastern spices more available. As cinnamon and nutmeg became more common in wealthy kitchens, galingale was quietly displaced. Even its name grew obscure. And then there's bastard balm, a cousin of lemon balm, with soft leaves and a gentle, almost creamy scent. It was used as a leafy herb, folded into dishes, or dried for tea. Some called it white hoary-hound, though the name varied from county to county. It had a following in certain abbey gardens, especially in the southwest of England, but its cultivation was always modest, and without steady use, it withered into obscurity. Now, only foragers and old herbalists speak its name. Among the vanished, vegetables are also countless varieties within a type names not even known now. There were Ashfield onions, small and red-skinned, grey-leaf cabbages, frost-hardy and sweet, ladies' marrow peas, tender and short-seasoned. Each was bred for local soil, remembered by a handful of families, saved from one year to the next. But they weren't recorded in seed catalogues. No portraits, no treaties. When a storm ruined a crop or a family line ended, the seed might be lost forever. That's the truth beneath the story. Most vegetables were never named widely. They were just our leeks or the white ones. When a better one came along or when misfortune struck, they vanished. Not with drama, but with silence. A gap in the garden. A pot that no longer tasted quite the same. And yet, memory holds echoes. An old rhyme mentions a green that no longer grows. A carving in a chapel shows a leaf that can't be placed. A field guide from the 13th century lists a plant with no modern equivalent. Its drawing rough, but its value clear. These are the ghosts of vegetables vanished not because they failed, but because the world changed. But they mattered. They fed, they warmed cold homes, they filled empty bellies. They reminded those who grew them that the earth still gave, even in hard times. And once, they were chosen with care, planted with hope, and harvested with quiet joy. The next step in our journey leads not deeper into the past, but toward its shadow in the present, where modern hands try to remember, revive, and replant what was nearly lost. A garden being born again. We'll explore that next. The world turns quietly, and what once was lost sometimes stirs again. In an age of screens and steel, hands reach back into loam, fingertips brushing memory. Along the edges of hedgerows, in the corners of museum gardens, in community plots behind ancient abbey walls, something remarkable is happening. Forgotten vegetables are being grown once more, not for novelty, not for profit, but for remembrance, for taste, for the sake of understanding how our ancestors lived. Not in broad strokes, but in bites and spoonfuls. These are the Revival Garden's living archives, where old seeds are brought back to the light and long-lost flavours find their way into bowls again. One such garden sits beside a medieval hall house, now a museum. Its beds are rough and deeply dug, nothing neat or symmetrical. But each plot holds a story. Here's Skerrit, its spindly green stalks quivering in the wind. A small label carved in wood reads, "Medieval sweet root. Rare. Volunteers tend it gently, knowing its roots twist and split if pulled too roughly. In autumn, they roast it with salt and oil and pass slices to curious visitors who always blink at the flavour. Like parsnip, they say, but different, sweeter, smoother, not far off." Good King Henry thrives in a shaded patch, no longer dismissed as a weed. It's watered and harvested with care. Its leaves are steamed with butter and wild garlic. Its seeds are collected on linen cloths, threshed with fingers, then stored in small paper packets, each labelled with the year. Beside it, a tall patch of Alexander's leans into the Sunday. It has returned from the hedgerows to the garden. Its flavour still strong, still peppery, but those who taste it speak with surprise. "How did we forget this?" they ask. "It tastes like the sea." And indeed, it does briny and bold, as if it carries the memory of coastal wind. Many of these revival gardens partner with heritage seed banks. They seek out old varieties, the long-forgotten marsh mallow, the frost-loving sea kale, even rare forms of mustard and beetroot once listed in abbey ledgers. Sometimes the seeds are found in old seed drawers, tucked into parchment envelopes labelled in Latin. Other times, they're rescued from the edges of a field, grown by one family for generations without ever knowing their rarity. One such seed is Naview, a medieval turnip with a spicy edge. It was nearly lost. But a farmer in Devon had saved it, not for nostalgia, but because it made good pig feed and didn't mind the wet. Now, it grows again in trial plots, its roots knobbly and fierce, its greens sharp and rich. Volunteers harvest it in October. Some roast it with herbs, others mash it with apple and honey, following an old monastery recipe found scrawled in the margin of a ledger. Every revived vegetable brings with it more than flavour. It brings questions. Who ate this? When? With what? What did it taste like boiled in a clay pot, stirred with a hazel branch, served with black bread and a bit of cheese? Revival gardeners answer these not just with words, but with recreation. They cook in open hearths. They grind with stone. They taste, not to judge, but to understand. In one corner of the garden stands a low table set for a small feast. Clay bowls hold boiled auroch, pale green with a hint of lemon. There's horseradish leaf salad, dressed with vinegar and honey. Parsnip pie, sweetened with dried figs. Pea mash with lovage and caraway. Nothing fancy, but everything old, everything remembered. Children pass through on school trips, crunching on raw turnip and wrinkling their noses. "People really ate this?" they ask. The gardener smiles. "Yes, And not just survived on it, they liked it. Taste, like memory, is generational. One woman, in her 70s, volunteers twice a week. Her grandmother used to grow chickweed and fat hen, though she never called them that. Just greens, she says, for Tuesday broth. Now she tends a patch of each, letting them go to seed, saving the next round. Another man brings seeds from France, old purslane and sorrel, used in his great-grandmother's pottage. He speaks little English, but in the garden, they don't need much talking. Only trowels, watering cans, and time. In some places, revival gardens have grown into full, experimental farms. They not only test flavour and nutrition, but yield, hardiness, and soil health. They compare medieval onions with modern ones. They study how wild leeks resist pests. They ask what was lost when we chose uniformity over diversity. And sometimes, they find that what was old might still be best. That sea beet still grows with no care. That nettles, properly prepared, rival spinach in iron. That broad beans, when cooked with fennel and garlic, hold a flavour worth remembering. The revival gardens don't promise to change the world. They simply remind us of what it once was, of how food connects us to place, to hands, to time, of how a single seed can carry memory across centuries. As the sun begins to dip, long shadows fall across the old brick paths and the rough plots of chard and salsify. A volunteer kneels to tie up a leaning stalk. A boy brings a watering pail. Someone hums an old tune, the kind no one writes down, but everyone knows. And in the soft hush of earth and effort, you feel it. The garden lives again. Next, we'll walk back to the world that surrounds it, to the kitchens, families and meals that kept these vegetables part of everyday life. Not because they were special, but because they were there, because they mattered. We'll visit the hearth next. The door creaks open on leather hinges, and the warmth inside greets you like an old wool cloak. Soft, musty, and welcome. This is no great hall, no monastery kitchen, just a single room where fire dances low on a stone hearth, where smoke lingers in the rafters, and every corner smells faintly of ash, herbs, and life. This is the heart of the medieval home, and here, the forgotten vegetables live not in glory, but in quiet usefulness. In pottage, in broth, in a thick, bubbling pot that rarely left the fire. In nearly every peasant home, from the fens of East Anglia to the valleys of France, the central meal was a slowly simmered mixture of what was gathered, grown, left over, or available. It changed with the seasons. It shifted with the weather, but it was always there, and vegetables were always at its heart. On a spring morning, the pot might begin with chickweed, sorrel, and a handful of fresh wild garlic. These would be boiled with oats or barley, perhaps thickened with old bread, and flavoured with a pinch of salt if the house could spare it. In high summer, the pot might welcome chopped broad beans, good King Henry, and mallow leaves, stirred with goat's milk or ale, a few wild onions, maybe a strip of salted pork, and in winter, when the fields slept and the greens vanished, then it was turnip, leek, and parsnip, boiled soft and mashed together with dried peas or lentils. Root upon root, memory upon memory, these dishes weren't written down, they weren't measured, or weighed, or named. They were handed from hand to hand, ladle to bowl, generation to mouth. A grandmother taught you which weeds to pick. A mother showed you when the pot needed stirring. A child learned by taste. When a leaf was too bitter, when a root wasn't ready, when the broth was thin, vegetables didn't just feed, they educated. And for the poor, especially, they protected. When meat was rare, and it often was, it was the forgotten vegetables that filled the space between hunger and enough. Fat hen, cooked with barley, could mimic the texture of meat. Nettles, when boiled twice, made a thick and nutritious soup. Celery leaf and parsley root added sharpness and body to plain broths. And for the sick, there was borage, simmered with honey. Turnip broth, thin and clear. For fevers, A mash of skirret and milk for those too weak to chew. These weren't meals of desperation. They were meals of knowing. Meals where waste had no place. Where carrot tops became seasoning. Where beet stalks were pickled. Where a second boil drew out the last of the flavour, and the hearth never fully went cold. Every evening, a log was banked, embers saved, so that in the morning the pot could begin again. Yesterday's broth thickened with today's greens. Tomorrow's lentils soaking nearby. The pot was a journal of life. Unwritten, but understood. Even its tools were intimate. A wooden spoon, darkened with years. A clay pot, cracked and patched with wire. A linen cloth, used to strain herbs. A stone bowl, cool and weighty, where vegetables were pounded, mixed, tasted. Sometimes, when the pottage was especially good, a bit would be shared. A ladle taken to an ill neighbour. A bowl placed at the church door. A bite offered to a passing traveller. Vegetables gave community. They crossed fences and class lines, sometimes subtly, often silently. Even in noble homes, the kitchen hearth saw humble fare. A cook, tired after a feast, might boil up beet greens and barley for the scullery boys. A monk might simmer celeriac with old cheese rinds. A washerwoman, paid in grain, might trade for a bowl of lentil leek stew with her afternoon chores. No one talked about it, but it mattered. In some homes, the hearth doubled as a medicine chest. You'd find bundles of fennel and costmary hung above, nettle seeds drying on a board, a crock of sorrel vinegar for wounds, a jar of mustard paste wrapped in linen, and if you looked carefully into the embers, you might even see a root roasting not for supper, but for tea, perhaps elecampane for cough, or parsley root for the stomach. The hearth didn't just feed the body, it nurtured every part of life. At night, the fire glowed low, the pot emptied, and the vegetables now lived in the stories told between sips of broth. Do you remember the cold year, when we lived off turnip leaves? Your grandfather grew a chard as long as your arm. Uncle Rob used to trade Alexanders for candles. In those stories, vegetables were more than food. They were memory, resilience, home. Even today, in quiet kitchens with electric stoves and stainless steel pans, that hum still lingers. In a pot of lentils stirred with thyme. In a salad made from weeds and lemon. In the hand that picks up a leek and remembers that it fed so many, for so long, with so little thanks. Next, we step out from the hearth, into fields touched by the passage of time, not only in history, but in climate, in soil, in change, where the old ways meet new questions, and where the vegetables of the past may help answer them. We'll go there next. Beyond the village lanes, and the hearth's warm glow, the landscape stretches wider, more uncertain. The soil beneath your feet is older than stories, yet changing fast. Seasons come earlier, linger longer, or arrive with a quiet wrongness no calendar can name. Rain falls harder, frosts retreat and return in fits. Summers are fierce, dry, unsure, and in this shifting world, the forgotten vegetables speak again, not as quaint curiosities, but as answers, because long before chemical fertilizers, plastic seed packets, and refrigerated trucks, these crops knew how to endure, how to yield in poor soil, how to feed through hardship, how to ask little and give much. Their names whisper resilience. Take field peas, those small speckled seeds that once fed armies and abbeys. They grow with ease in cold climates, fix nitrogen in tired soil, and mature quickly. In modern farming, they've been overshadowed by their tender green cousins. But field peas don't need irrigation. They need patience, and not much else. Or rampion, a root once loved in Italy and northern Europe. It looks like a pale carrot, grows in thin soil, and offers both leaves and roots. It vanished not from failure, but from disinterest. Yet now, in rocky hillsides and windy plains, it's being tested again, because it thrives where modern crops falter, or sea kale, that thick-leafed brassica from salt-sprayed coasts. It tolerates wind, needs little water, and gives sweet, blanched shoots in spring. Its roots run deep. Its leaves resist pests. For centuries, it was foraged, then forgotten. Now, it's studied for coastal farms, for erosion-prone lands, for a future shaped more by extremes than by plans. Even fat hen, so often dismissed as weed, proves quietly powerful. Its seeds are high in protein, its leaves rich in minerals. It grows fast, wild, in disturbed soil, and when cultivated intentionally, it feeds without fuss. No irrigation, no fertilizer, no complaint. Across Europe, small research farms are turning back the clock, not for romance but for survival. They plant medieval cabbages alongside modern hybrids. Compare heritage turnips to lab-bred ones. Test bitter greens that once flavoured peasant pottage against climate-stressed lettuce. And often, the old ones win because they were born from struggle, bred by selection, not science, chosen by hands that needed them to thrive through real winters, real droughts, real disease. Their toughness is not just folklore, it's coded in seed. One researcher holds up a dried skirret seed and says, "This one needs nothing, just damp soil and time." Another speaks of orache, once grown on poor land, now revived for its salt tolerance. Another still grows salsify on hillside plots where machines can't reach. In Poland, wild sorrels are studied for food forests. In Ireland, red-rooted beet is tested for flood resistance. In Denmark, Alexanders long gone from farms are being reintroduced in coastal agroforestry. And in every case, the past offers not nostalgia, but help. This revival is not about going backward. It's about remembering that forward once had many paths, and some were wiser than they seemed. Small farms, permaculture plots, school gardens, they all experiment now with ancient greens, not to reenact medieval life, but to learn from it. To ask, what crops grow without chemicals? What vegetables resist drought? What greens can feed a family when the grocery shelves falter? Forgotten vegetables answer with quiet strength, even in urban settings, where rooftops replace fields and containers hold soil instead of hedged gardens. Old vegetables find root. Lamb's lettuce, once a winter staple, grows in windowsills. Chervil flourishes in balconies. Nettle, planted carefully, becomes tea, soup, salad. Some neighborhoods start resilience beds, patches of soil dedicated not to aesthetics, but to function. Edges of schoolyards host mallow. Community plots grow black, salsify. Elderly residents share tips once told to them by grandmothers now long gone. The vegetables, it turns out, never truly disappeared. They just waited in hedges, in old seed banks, in the corners of language, where a recipe mentioned that green from near the stream, waited for a time when they'd be needed again. And that time, quietly, is arriving. It's in the stories told between gardeners, in the farmers' markets where someone brings a vegetable no one recognizes, but everyone wants to taste. In the research papers tucked behind paywalls, and the backyards where volunteers trade seeds by hand. Forgotten vegetables are becoming remembered, not because they're fashionable, but because they work. They grow in thin soil, in drought, in unpredictability. They belong to no empire, no industry, just to people. And their gift, as always, is humble. Food, not just enough to survive, but enough to learn, to share, to hold something old and valuable in your palm and say, "This still matters." As we continue our journey, we'll look next at how these vegetables shaped not only meals, but meaning, how they became metaphors, symbols, tools in tales and rituals and quiet prayers whispered before the pot boiled. Because food, in any age, feeds more than hunger. It feeds story. And vegetables, though humble, always found their place in the telling. We'll explore that next. There is a kind of hush that settles not just over a garden, but over language when it lingers too long in one place. In every village, in every valley, in every kitchen where vegetables grew, they crept slowly into story not as heroes, but as symbols, as messengers, as humble carriers of meaning, deeper than their roots. Vegetables, after all, were not only food. They were folklore. Start with leeks. In Wales, they became a badge of pride, a mark of identity. Ancient tales tell of soldiers who placed leeks in their helmets to distinguish themselves in battle, not for magic, but for recognition, for belonging. And every spring, leeks were honoured not because they fed the poor, though they did, but because they stood for something larger: memory, unity, and the earth itself. Even in stories told to children, leeks had power. They were said to grow where brave men fell, to sprout in places touched by ancient struggle. A simple vegetable, crowned with symbolism. Or consider garlic. It appears not only in recipes, but in charms, in prayers, in old wives' tales, whispered near the cradle. Garlic was protection, hung in doorways to ward off evil, worn around the neck of a feverish child, boiled into milk for strength, given in small slices to travellers, not only for sustenance, but for safety. In medieval England, and across much of Europe, garlic held dual lives, in the pot and in the warding circle. Peasants may not have known the word antibacterial, but they knew what garlic could do. They knew that its scent meant strength, that its bite might banish more than hunger. Then there's nettles, sharp, stinging, unwanted, and yet, in many old tales, nettles were a test. The fairy tale of the silent sister who must weave shirts of nettle for her cursed brothers, the story of the healing woman who brews nettle tea for her enemies and turns them into friends. Nettles reminded people that what stings could also soothe, that the wild had its uses, and in kitchens this truth was tasted. Nettle soup fed tired bones, nettle fibres made thread. Nettle seeds were given to hens to keep them laying through winter. A weed? Maybe, but also a medicine, a lesson. Turnips too found their way into riddles and rhymes. The turnip that grew so large it took a whole village to pull grandfather, grandmother, grandchild, dog, cat, mouse. A parable about patience, about community, about how even the smallest effort matters. In Germanic folk tales, turnips stood for transformation, planted, forgotten, then harvested into something vast and unexpected. In rural England, carved turnips were once used as lanterns before pumpkins ever arrived. Lit with tallow, placed on thresholds to scare away the restless dead. On All Hallows' Eve, turnips glowed in the dark, both real and symbolic. Parsnips held quieter meaning. They appeared in Lent meals, during times of fasting. Their sweetness reminded those who abstained that pleasure could come in unexpected places. In certain monastic texts, the parsnip represented modesty, a sweetness that grew underground, unseen. In some French regions, a mother would give her daughter a parsnip on her wedding day, a symbol not of wealth, but of endurance, a root that persisted through cold, a reminder that sweetness takes time. Then there was cabbage. Cabbage was common, ubiquitous, yet deeply revered in certain superstitions. To dream of cabbage was to dream of health, or, in some places, of unexpected fortune. Newborns, it was said, were found under cabbage leaves at least. When children asked awkward questions, a tale of innocence, of origin, of life beginning in the garden, and in some parts of Eastern Europe, brides carried cabbage leaves tucked into their skirts to bring fertility. Even beans so plain, so daily were caught in lore. In ancient times, beans were thought to contain souls, to link the living to the dead. In some medieval festivals, a bean was hidden in a cake. The one who found it became the bean king for the day. A reversal of roles. A brief carnival of chance, all tied to a single legume. Peas, too, found their way into parable. The tale of the princess and the pea-delicate skin bruised by a single seed beneath layers of bedding was born long after the Middle Ages. But it echoes older truths, that food and sensitivity were linked, that vegetables held more than nutrition. They tested spirit, class, perception, class. In these stories, vegetables were never the main characters, but they were always present. The silent witnesses to feast and famine, ritual and rhyme. They were in the background of blessings. May your larder be full of leeks and beans. May your hearth smell of garlic and bread. They were in curses too. May your beetroot rot in the ground. May your carrots grow bitter. Language held their memory, even as palates changed. And in quiet ways, they offered comfort. A steaming bowl of nettle soup when a baby was born. A stew of onion, lentil, and lovage before a journey. A handful of wild sorrel given to a weeping child to chew and smile again. Today, those stories linger. In lullabies hummed without knowing their meaning. In tales passed down at garden gates. In symbols carved into old church pews, a leek, a turnip, a sheaf of chard weathered but still visible. Because the vegetables were never just about eating. They were about living, about remembering. And perhaps, as we look once more at the plants we nearly let slip away, we find not just food, but threads of the tapestry that made daily life rich, layered, and deeply human. In the next part, we turn toward the seasons themselves, how each one shaped the vegetable world, and how medieval growers danced with nature rather than fought it. A quiet rhythm, a kind of trust. We'll walk that cycle next. The medieval farmer didn't mark time with clocks or calendars. He felt it, in the pull of frost from the earth, in the lengthening of shadows, in the chorus of birds that shifted, subtly, season to season, and with that rhythm came a dance, a quiet, instinctive choreography with the land, a turning wheel of expectation, patience, and harvest. And at its center, the vegetables, not grown with sprays or motors or artificial light, but with timing, observation, the kind of knowing that comes only from years of walking the same soil. It began with late winter, when breath still clouded the air and the sun rose reluctant. This was the time of planning, mending tools, and waking seeds. Stored vegetables were dwindling, but leeks, overwintered, still stood tall in the beds, their green tops ragged from wind. Parsnips, if not yet harvested, were sweeter now than ever nature's sugar hardened by frost. Indoors, peas were soaked in warm cloths, onion sets were sorted, and old bean seeds tested in pots of damp ash or moss. The ground thawed slowly. When it softened, digging began, not in haste, but with reverence. The soil had rested. Now it was ready. In early spring, the first sowings began. Spinach, cress, and orach were scattered lightly, their seeds tucked into shallow furrows with cold, bare hands. These greens came quickly, feeding hungry mouths that had known lean days. Peas were pushed into the ground near sticks, and broad beans, tough and brave, were sown in neat lines. Some farms even planted wild mustard or lamb's lettuce, knowing it would bolt early but give fast yield. And as days warmed, a second wave began. Radishes, carrots, and early onions. In late spring, the garden thickened. Lovage rose from the soil like a memory reborn. Chervil curled along the ground, delicate and fleeting. Alexanders shot skyward, bitter and bold. Beets unfurled heavy leaves. Drinking Sunday, it was a time of weeding, thinning, watching, and among it all, women carried baskets, collecting young greens before they grew too tough. Nettles, mallow, fat hen, sorrel, all gathered before the summer heat, would drive bitterness into their stems. By midsummer, the vegetable beds pulsed with life. Leeks were sturdy now. Cabbage formed tight heads. Carrots stretched down. Turnips began to swell. Parsley went to seed, but not before giving its last burst of green. Yet even at the peak, the work was careful. Too much water, and roots would rot. Too little, and yield would suffer. Gardens were watched, like children fed, shaded, protected. In noble gardens, trellises bore gourds and artichokes. In monastic ones, herbs were harvested in moonlight, their potency tied to tide and star. But always, even in bounty, there was preparing. For summer was not the end, it was the edge. Late summer was a time of pickling, drying, preserving. Onions were lifted and left in rows to cure. Garlic was braided and hung. Herbs were bundled and dried near hearths. Beets and turnips were sliced, salted, and stored in crocks. And a second sowing began for autumn crops. More spinach, more radishes, field lettuce, chard, greens that would tolerate the cooling days. Even skirret and salsify late roots that matured as frost drew near were planted now, with faith in what the cold would do. As autumn deepened, the garden slowed. Leaves yellowed. Growth hesitated. But underground, life continued. This was the time to pull the last of the parsnips, to gather celeriac, to dig scorzonera, its black roots sharp with cold. Turnips, stored in cellars, were checked for rot. Beans, long dried on vines, were shelled and stored. It was a time of inventory. What would last? What had failed? What would be needed for the winter table and what for next year's seed? In villages and towns, vegetable surpluses were shared, bartered, or boiled into feasts before the true cold arrived. Nothing wasted. Everything used. And then, as winter set in, the garden rested. Only the hardiest crops remained: leeks, kale, winter spinach tucked beneath straw. But inside homes, the vegetables still spoke. In soup, in mash, in pies and puddings and porridge. In clay jars, pickled beetroot. In baskets, dry onions. In bundles, dried herbs for broth. Even when the earth slept, its memory lingered on every plate. This cycle, this rhythm, was not rigid. It bent with weather, with pestilence, with fortune. A rainy spring could ruin the onions. A dry summer could shrivel the beans. A wet autumn might spoil the roots. But the gardener watched, adjusted, trusted. There were no pesticides, no greenhouses. Only the land, the knowledge passed down, and the will to feed a family. Vegetables weren't slotted into factory rows. They were planted in harmony with the moon, with the slope of the land, with the shade cast by elder trees. There was wisdom in waiting, and joy in the first green shoot that broke through thawed earth. This rhythm, largely forgotten today, held the life of entire communities. And in some corners of the world, it stirs again gardens timed not by apps, but by birdsong and breath. Where a child sows a seed because the soil feels just warm enough. Where a grandmother lifts a leek and nods, it's time. Where vegetables, once forgotten, grow again because someone remembered the rhythm. In our next chapter, we'll explore how this rhythm wasn't just practical, but spiritual. How the growing of vegetables wove itself into faith, festival, and the marking of sacred time. Because the garden, in the Middle Ages, was never just a place of toil. It was a place of wonder. In the medieval world, soil was more than ground. It was mystery. It held the power to birth, to nourish, to rot, and to return. And those who worked the earth rarely saw it as theirs alone. They saw it as Lent. To plant a seed was not merely an act of labor. It was an invocation, a gesture of hope, and a whisper of trust in forces greater than the hand. Faith wrapped itself around farming like ivy on stone. And vegetables? They lived within that faith. Let's begin in the monastery garden. Walled and quiet, its beds arranged in tidy symmetry, the Hortus Conclusus, the enclosed garden, was both a food source and a meditation. Each row was carefully chosen, not just for flavor or healing, but for meaning. Chard, for humility, its stalks bright, its leaves plain. Leeks, for purity tall and simple, like prayers rising from the earth. Parsley, for eternal life evergreen, ever returning. Even the layout echoed scripture. 4 plots, divided by 2 paths, forming a cross, a central well symbol of baptism, a bench, shaded by fruit trees, echoes of Eden. To the monks, weeding was discipline, harvesting was gratitude, composting was resurrection. What once decayed would give life again. But beyond the monastery, faith in the land pulsed just as deeply. In village fields and cottage gardens, planting was timed not only by frost or sun, but by saints' days and holy feasts. Street Benedict's Day might mark the sowing of peas. Street Isidore's feast, the ploughing of communal fields. Lammas, the blessing of loaves made from first grains, often paired with a simple stew of onions, herbs, and broad beans, the first true meal of the harvest. Even before sowing, seeds were sometimes sprinkled with blessed water or left beneath an icon for a night. A gesture not of superstition, but of surrender. The growing was in God's hands, and if a drought came, or a blight, there were prayers not only for rain, but for forgiveness. A failed crop might be seen not just as misfortune, but as warning, a call to charity, a test of community. But when the crops flourished, so too did celebration. Many vegetable harvests were marked with festivals. Turnip Night, in parts of northern Europe, blended the end of harvest with merriment. Lanterns carved from turnips glowed in dark fields. Songs were sung. Simple dishes of roasted roots and herb pies were shared by firelight. At Michaelmas, the end of the harvest season, families made special tarts with leeks and chard, spiced with nutmeg if fortune allowed, a sign of completion, a prayer for warmth through winter. These were not grand rituals, they were gestures, small, steady, woven into life, and in them, vegetables took on quiet holiness. Beans were never counted at table, old belief said to do so tempted famine. A cabbage cut on Good Friday was said to keep its freshness twice as long. Garlic, planted at the waning moon, protected the home. These customs varied by region, but their spirit was shared. Reverence. Not fear, not magic. Just respect for the land, for the cycle, for the mystery. Even the act of preserving vegetables had ritual weight. Pickling, for instance, was often done on particular days thought to close the vegetable's spirit inside the jar. Crops were buried in straw or brine not just for storage, but as if tucking them into sleep. A winter fast. And as Lent approached, when meat was scarce and spirits stretched thin, vegetables became sacraments of endurance. A bowl of lentils and leeks might be all that stood between hunger and hope. A loaf of bean bread, shared at a meagre table, could feel like communion. And come Easter, the first greens, nettle tops, wild cress, young sorrel were gathered with joy, cooked with egg or cheese, and eaten with a gratitude deeper than words. They were resurrection on a plate. Even in death, vegetables had a place. In some regions, mourners would leave a sprig of parsley or fennel with the departed, a nod to life continuing, a taste that lingered, a plant that would rise again, because vegetables reminded people that endings weren't endings, only transitions. Like the seed, they slept, then stirred, then bloomed, and so, in vegetable beds scattered across cloister, cottage, and castle, a quiet theology bloomed alongside the roots, not preached from pulpits, lived, tilled into soil, whispered at planting, honored at harvest. This sacredness didn't require grandeur, just the daily care of a gardener who saw in each stalk and leaf not just food but a promise, a rhythm, a miracle as ordinary as mud. In our next chapter, we'll step into one final space where vegetables made their quiet mark, into love and courtship, into households built not just on bread and work, but on shared meals, and the subtle ways vegetables shaped bonds, comforted the heart, and fed the beginnings of family, because love, too, was often planted and fed in the garden. In the Middle Ages, love seldom came with roses, not the soft-petaled, perfumed tokens we now associate with romance, not often with sonnets or silken letters. It came with soup, with effort, with vegetables, with food grown by hand, shared by hearth, prepared with care. Courtship, for most medieval folk, unfolded not in ballads but in gardens, kitchens, and meadows, in baskets of leeks, rinsed clean for a shared meal, in the passing of seeds between families, in borrowed tools, shared harvests, and quiet glances over rows of beans and onions. To love was to labour, and vegetables were often the first gifts exchanged. In rural villages, it was common for a young man to help weed or water in the garden of a family whose daughter he admired, not to win her over with flattery, but with presence, with steadiness, with work. And if she, in turn, packed him a parcel of early radishes or a little dish of herbed peas, it was noticed. Noted, talked about in whispers among sisters, or over bread with mothers. Food was language. Good King Henry cooked in cream wasn't just dinner, it was a sign of affection. A forage salad of chickweed, wild garlic, and nettle tops, gently blanched and served with soft cheese. That was courtship. Even broad beans, boiled with parsley and dressed with vinegar, might signal something more if served with a second bowl and a smile. In towns and abbeys, things were more formal. But still, the kitchen garden played its part. Apprentices might earn favour not only through craft, but by bringing in bundles of fresh spinach or a well-culled bunch of sorrel for the cook's midday stew. And young maids might be seen picking celeriac leaves or trimming lovage, their movements watched, admired, noted. Vegetables marked seasons, and seasons shaped romance. In spring, shared tasks blossomed. Two youths sent to gather mallow or purslane might return with more than greens. Hands might brush. Laughter might begin. In summer, couples weeded together, one row apart, and in the long golden twilight after work, meals were shared, often cold dishes of lentils, roasted roots, and herbs. In autumn, the harvest gave excuse to linger, to walk together, carrying cabbages or beets, their weight grounding but their company lifting. And in winter, it was the pickled and the dried, the stored and the saved, that sustained affection. Love was never extravagant. It was quiet, practical, rooted in the real. Like a good parsnip, it deepened in the cold. Like leek stew, it grew sweeter the longer it simmered. Even engagements were sometimes marked with vegetables. A gift of seed, especially from one family to another, signified more than agriculture. It meant, we share our future. A dowry might include dried onion strings, baskets of preserved greens, even a clay jar of skirret seeds wrapped in linen. And the wedding feast? Rarely luxurious in peasant homes, but deeply symbolic. Peas and mint, for joy and union. Leeks, for prosperity. Parsley, for long life. Bean cakes sweetened with dried fruit. Salsify roasted with honey. Everything chosen with care. Everything echoing tradition. One old poem, long forgotten in most tongues, tells of a bride stirring a pot of vegetable soup before her first night in her new home. The act was part of blessing, nourishment for the household, a way to say, we begin. Even among the nobility, where marriages were often arranged, food carried emotional weight. A noblewoman might send a salad of sorrel and violets to her betrothed, a subtle message, bittersweet but fresh. A servant girl, trusted by both, might deliver a parcel of dried herbs between them meant for the cook, but scented with more than rosemary. And for those who loved in secrecy, vegetables became code. A basket of radishes, if placed in the window, might mean, "I'm thinking of you." A dish with extra mustard leaf might carry a warning. It sounds like fiction, but stories told by hearths for centuries keep the memory alive. Even heartache had its foods. In France, a rejected lover might eat wild chicory, bitter and blue to reflect his sorrow. In England, the broken-hearted were said to roast onions, then sit alone, breathing their sharpness, weeping with dignity. And yet, even these gestures were wrapped in care, because food was always more than sustenance. It was expression, comfort, language between those who had little else. The kitchen garden, then, was not just a place of toil. It was the cradle of relationships, a space where tenderness took root, not in words, but in the gift of warmth, the offer of stew, the shared labour of feeding others. To love was to grow, to cook, to offer. To love was to peel turnips together, to shell peas by candlelight, to kneel side by side, pressing spinach seeds into spring soil. In our next chapter, we journey deeper into memory, into the ways these vegetables appear, not just in history, but in the generational stories that linger still. The taste of a dish that grandmother made, the smell of a stew before winter, the forgotten plant that suddenly feels like home. Because what was once forgotten often waits to be remembered. A bowl of soup, that's all it takes sometimes. A bowl of soup, or a roasted root, or a leaf picked warm from the sun, and suddenly the years fold inward. You're not in your kitchen anymore. You're somewhere older, deeper, somewhere remembered. For many, the taste of a forgotten vegetable is a bridge not just to history, but to family, to home, to the hands that stirred and served before you ever knew their names. Because long after names are lost and tools rust and houses fall, flavour remains. And flavour, more than any scroll or monument, carries memory. Take sorrel sharp, lemony, green. For one elderly woman in Brittany, it was the first thing she tasted every spring. Her grandmother grew it near the rain barrel and made soup with eggs and cream the day after Easter. The sorrel soup, she said once, eyes glistening, meant the world was alive again. Or borage, with its fuzzy leaves and cucumber bite. A man in northern England remembers picking it for his mother's summer tonic steeped with lemon peel, served cold in chipped cups. It tasted of fields and honeyed air. "We didn't know it was medieval," he laughs. "We just knew it worked, and nettles so long scorned as weeds." Now, in eco-conscious kitchens, they return, blanched, pureed, fried. But for a few, especially the oldest, nettle soup tastes like childhood, wartime, the hill behind the house. A mother's voice saying, "Don't pull the ones near the road, they've got soot." Taste holds truth, even in silence. A refugee from Eastern Europe, unable to speak her story, cooked instead. And when she served a stew of beet greens, parsnips and caraway, her granddaughter understood something sacred had been passed down, not in words, in flavour. In every culture, every kitchen, this thread appears. Fat hen, in India, becomes bathua stirred into lentils, cooked with garlic, wild mustard greens in Greece, boiled with lemon and oil, taste of feast days and fasts. Celeriac in Poland, grated with apple and horseradish, becomes a funeral dish, a wedding side, a Tuesday salad. Even in places where the names have changed, the tastes remain. Old flavours don't vanish. They migrate, adapt, settle into new hands, and sometimes they return. In Scotland, a young chef tastes skirret for the first time in a monastery garden. He closes his eyes. "It's like my nan's Sunday mash," he murmurs, "but brighter." In Italy, a farmer stumbles across rampion in a hedgerow. His mother recognizes it instantly. "Your great-uncle grew that," she says, plucking a leaf. "We used to eat it raw with salt." In a quiet kitchen in Wales, and one one-year-old girl grows oric in a window box. She sprinkles it into soup. Her grandmother sips it, startled. "That's what we had," she says softly. In the hunger year, there's power in such small rediscoveries. Not because they fix anything, but because they connect. They remind us that we come from hands that grew and stirred and served. That even the humblest vegetable carried care. That meals were not just calories, they were moments. A boy peeling turnips beside his grandfather. A woman tucking parsley into a cloth before church. A child chewing wild celery while chasing chickens. These are not grand histories, but they are true. And in their quiet truth, they outlast kings and wars and all the noise in between. That's why so many today return to the garden, not to reenact the past, but to taste it, to touch it, to remember. When a mother sows broad beans beside her daughter, she passes more than a plant. She passes rhythm, patience, the memory of her own mother's garden. When an old man roasts parsnips for a neighborhood supper, he shares more than food. He offers a flavor his ancestors knew, a thread in the tapestry. And when someone bites into lovage for the first time and says, "This tastes old," they don't mean stale. They mean familiar, as if the tongue remembers what the mind forgot. Taste is primal. It belongs not to one age, but to all. It is the way history becomes real. Not distant, not dusty, but warm, savory, slightly sweet. It's charred in oil. Pea mash with mint, salsify sliced thin, and fried crisp. It's memory on a plate. And even now, in this modern moment of pre-packaged meals and glowing screens, the taste of a forgotten vegetable can stop time, can close the distance between then and now, between them and us. So plant a seed, taste the leaf, roast the root, not to play at history, but to remember that you are part of it. In our next part, we'll visit the final turning the twilight of a garden, the fading of knowledge, and the quiet resilience of those who kept it alive even when the world forgot. The caretakers of seeds, the whisperers of soil. We'll go to them next. Every tradition has its twilight. There comes a time when what once was common becomes rare, when what once filled bowls and bellies slips quietly from fields, from kitchens, from memory. For medieval vegetables, that twilight came slowly. The rise of new foods from distant lands, tomatoes, potatoes, maize, transformed European diets. Their novelty, yield, and versatility drew attention. Fields were replanted, recipes rewritten, and bit by bit the old vegetables faded. Skirret made way for potatoes, rampion yielded to carrots, fat hen was weeded out for spinach, and yet not everything was lost. In corners of Europe, on isolated hillsides and tucked away villages, a handful of souls kept planting the old seeds, not because they were rare or precious, but because they worked, because they fed, because they were part of life. These were the Seedkeepers. They didn't call themselves that, not then. They were simply gardeners, grandmothers, monks, shepherds, midwives, people close to the land. In alpine valleys, a widow planted black salsify beside her door each spring. Her mother had done the same. She never bought seeds, she saved her own, shaking them from dry pods into a paper cone made from old calendars. In southern Italy, a quiet brotherhood of monks tended a walled kitchen garden where Alexanders grew between stones. When asked why, one replied, "Because it remembers us." In Brittany, A fisherman's wife always kept a patch of sorrel and lovage behind her house. Not for sale, not for show, for the soup she made each year on her wedding anniversary. These acts were not grand gestures. They were habits, preservation by practice, and in those quiet hands, the medieval vegetables survived. Sometimes, the knowledge passed in recipe alone. You boil the chard till it sighs. You fry the parsnip like a fish. You gather the nettles young, or not at all. Other times it passed in seed pressed into a child's palm, sewn into a hem, hidden in a loaf of bread carried across borders. And sometimes it passed in stories. My mother grew this when we had nothing. Your grandfather always planted 2 rows, one for the pot, one for the birds. Eat this, it kept us alive. But as the world quickened, fewer remembered. Supermarkets offered uniform vegetables, shaped for shipping, not taste. Families moved from land to pavement. Seasons became abstract, and the seeds sat quiet, in drawers, in jars on forgotten shelves, in letters tucked into cookbooks, until something stirred. In the 20th century, a wave of curiosity, concern, and care brought the old vegetables back into question. Scientists, chefs, and gardeners began asking, "What have we lost?" And the seedkeepers, older now, answered. They opened cupboards, brought out hand-labelled envelopes, told stories with cracked voices. I think this is skirret. My uncle grew it every year. This is the old spinach. It bolts fast but tastes strong. I don't know its name. We just called it the winter green. Seed banks formed. Heritage gardens grew. But it wasn't just institutions that saved the past. It was individuals. A retired nurse in Sweden began mailing rampion seed to strangers who asked. A French schoolteacher planted celeriac from her grandmother's line and taught children how to mulch it for winter. A woman in Yorkshire kept a spreadsheet of who had taken her parsnip seed so she could gently remind them, come spring, to pass it on. These were not acts of nostalgia. They were acts of continuity, of quiet resistance to forgetting, and they echo the work done by unnamed farmers 1,000 years before those who selected seeds by hand, not science. Who knew which root fed best in drought, which leaf stayed tender, which stem split too soon? The Seedkeepers, old and new, belong to a single lineage, one of attention, of humility, of care, and today their work continues. Not just in libraries or curated gardens, but in backyards, balconies, and borrowed plots. A woman in Lisbon grows good King Henry beside her roses. A teacher in Berlin starts a student project on medieval peas. A small cafe in Cornwall builds a seasonal menu around forgotten roots, each dish a tribute, a lesson, a taste of what fed our ancestors. Because the Seedkeepers knew what we are now remembering. That food is never just food. It is memory, it is connection, and it is trust in the seed, in the soil, in the cycle. So when we plant an ancient parsnip or boil nettles for soup, we are not recreating the past. We are carrying it forward, with gratitude, with hands in soil, with faith in what grows. In our final chapter, we'll return to where we began, not just to the field, but to the feeling, to what it means to reclaim these vegetables today, to hold in one's hand a thing once nearly lost, and to say, you matter still, because the forgotten never truly vanish. They wait, and they grow again. There's something powerful about holding a seed, not just for what it is small, dry, silent, but for what it promises, what it remembers. A seed does not mourn its past. It waits for its moment. And when that moment comes, when it meets the earth, the warmth, the water, it does not hesitate. It grows. So too do these forgotten vegetables. They were never lost entirely, only quiet. And now they speak again. In gardens hemmed with old stone walls, in balcony pots and urban plots, in the hands of chefs, farmers, dreamers, in the mouths of children who taste rampion, lovage, or broad beans and blink with surprise at the flavour. Yes, but also at something deeper, a kind of recognition, because the truth is, we are not strangers to these foods. We are descendants. The vegetables our ancestors planted still echo in our language, our customs, even our cravings. The savoury comfort of leek stew, the peppery lift of mustard greens, the gentle sweetness of parsnips, roasted until they caramelize. They remind us who we are, and they invite us to be part of something old and ongoing. To reclaim a forgotten vegetable is not to step backward, it is to step more fully into the present, to expand the range of what we know, what we grow, what we trust, and to do so gently, because these plants are not commodities. They are companions. They were bred for resilience, for community, for flavour over appearance, for nourishment over novelty. They fed saints and soldiers, peasants and poets. They stood through famine, flood, frost, and when called, they return unfussy, familiar, forgiving. To taste them again is to experience time in layers. A bowl of nettle soup eaten in 2025 echoes one eaten in 1225. A bite of scorzonera links the belly of a modern gardener to that of a medieval midwife. A single seed of skirret, pressed into damp soil by a child's finger, continues a chain that stretches back through centuries of hands. And that continuity matters. It tells us that not all knowledge comes in books, that some of the wisest lessons lie in the garden. To wait, to tend, to choose wisely what you grow, to value what endures, even when fashion forgets it. Across Europe and beyond, that lesson is being relearned. In schoolyards where children draw leaves of plants their great-grandparents once harvested. In seed exchanges where old women trade cress for fat hen with the care of sacred ritual. In greenhouses where young scientists test medieval greens for drought tolerance and soil repair. In kitchens where chefs rediscover how much can be done with a leek, an egg, and a bit of sorrel. There is a quiet movement growing, not to reconstruct the past, but to reweave it into now. To acknowledge that heritage isn't only castles and kings, it's the turnip stew that warmed a household. The onion bed planted in faith before spring came. The bitter greens that reminded the body of its strength. The forgotten vegetables offer not just flavour, but philosophy. They invite us to eat with intention, grow with care, remember with kindness, share, because no seed should be hoarded, no knowledge should be locked away. These plants survived because someone kept them alive. And now it is our turn, not to guard them like relics, but to use them, to let them flourish in new soil, under new suns, in hands that never knew a medieval field but feel the pull of it anyway. Plant them in backyard beds, add them to family meals, tell their stories, let the children taste them, let them laugh at the strange names. Good King Henry, Skirret, Alexander's, and then reach for seconds. Let them remember, and let them grow, because when we keep these vegetables alive, we do more than preserve history. We nurture resilience, we flavour the future, and we honour the countless quiet hands who once dug, washed, chopped, and served not for glory, but for love, for nourishment, for life. So pick up a seed, a root, a recipe. Start where you are, and know that in doing so, you're never alone. You are part of the story, and the story, like the garden, goes on.